In this module, we're going to explore routing, and I will explain what exactly routing is and why we need it. We'll have a look at how routing can make our Vue app better and actually helps us build a totally different kind of Vue app, you could say. You will therefore learn what and why routing is, but you will then, of course, also learn how to set up the Vue router and routes with it, and we'll then explore how to navigate around with routing, how to configure routing, and which different options you have there. So what is routing about? Attached you find another starting project which, when you start the server, gives you this simple application on the screen. This is a Vue app where we have two main areas, teams and users. We can switch between them, and for every team we can also click View Members, though at the moment nothing happens when we do that. So that's a very simple starting application, and if we have a look at this application, it looks like if we had two pages here, right? Two links here in the navigation, the teams and the users link. But what you will notice is that when I click those links, what we see on the screen changes, but the URL does not change. It's always the same URL. And that's in the end what routing will be about. With Vue, we build JavaScript-driven client-side web applications. So web applications where what the user sees is entirely controlled by JavaScript running in the browser. That is what Vue is all about. And we're also basically building a so-called single-page application, which means we have that one single HTML file which is being fetched, and that file includes imports to the scripts, to all the JavaScript code we're writing here in the end. Not to the code we are writing here, but to a slightly transformed and optimized version of that code. And the CLI is taking care of all of that behind the scenes. But in the end, it's all that JavaScript code which runs in the browser, which is responsible for what we see on the screen here. And that's why we call this kind of app a single-page application. So we want to have just one HTML file and then our JavaScript code controlling what we see on the screen. But with this approach, we have one problem. We have the same URL for all areas of our page. And that means if I would want to share this user's page with another user, well, I could just share this regular URL, which in this case is just our domain name and then nothing. And if you enter this and hit enter, you always end up on the starting page. So I can't share anything else than the starting page of this application, because the change that happens when I click this button is driven by JavaScript and has nothing to do with the URL. It just happens up on the button click here. And whilst this works and this application works, in reality you would want applications powered by Vue and powered by that client-side JavaScript code, which still interact with the URL, so that the URL represents where on the page we are, and so that we got a shareable URL, which we can share with our users, so that I could share a link to this user's page with our users of this web application. And of course, we could try to make this work by having more than one HTML file and then pointing at a different HTML file here, like users HTML, but that is not how this will work. This is not how you build such Vue applications. If you would do that, the script code loaded by that extra HTML file would be totally unrelated to your other script code, which is probably also not what you want. And that's the kind of problem routing will solve for us, because it turns out that there is a tool, an extra package which we can install, which allows us to handle URL changes with JavaScript in the browser and then load something different on the screen in the same single page application when that URL changes or based on that URL. And that same package will also help us change the URL when we navigate somewhere else in this application so that the URL reflects the place where we are in the app. And that is what routing is all about and why we might want it. So let's now install that extra package to get started with routing. To install this routing package, quit this running development server by pressing Ctrl+C here, and then run npm install --save view-router. This is another package developed by the official Vue team, so it's an official package, which you can add to your Vue projects to add this routing functionality. Now this will install this package, and once you're done installing it, you can restart your development server with npm run serve, but now we'll be able to add routing to this application. And what does this mean, add routing? Well, now we can go to main.js, where we create our main Vue app, this single app which we have here in the end. And on this app, we can now register this router which we just installed, and more importantly, the routes we want to have in this project. So simply the different URLs we want to support. And to do that, we need to import something from view-router, so from this newly installed package. And this something is a function, create router. So we have create app from Vue to create a Vue app. We have create router from Vue router to create a router for such an app. We can now create the router here, for example, simply by creating a new constant. Router sounds like a fitting name, and calling create router and storing the result of that call in this constant. But create router needs some configuration now. It needs to know which different routes, so which different URLs we want to support, and we can also set up more things. So for that, you pass a JavaScript object to create router, and in that object, we now got two important options which we can set. The obvious important option is the routes option. Here we register all the routes, the different paths, the different URLs, you could say, which we want to support. This will be an array because typically it's not just one route which you want to have in your app. If that would be the case, you don't need a router. So we'll have an array full of routes in here, and I will come back to this route config in just a second. But there also is another option which we should set, and that's the history option. Now, that is basically telling the router how to manage the routing history in this app. So when a user clicks somewhere, goes to a different page, then this new page is added to the browsing history, you could say. And if the user then clicks a back button, the history makes sure that, well, the router knows what the last page was. And there are two different kinds of history you could use here. And we want to import another function from ViewRouter here. And that's the create webHistory function, which we then call here as a history option. Now, this might sound confusing, but historically, JavaScript in the browser wasn't always able to manipulate the browser's memory on which page the user is on and where the user came from. Therefore, historically, the router had to emulate this behavior, you could say, and we didn't use the built-in browser history. But since a couple of years, this is no problem, and with create webHistory, by calling this function, we tell the router, hey, just use the browser's built-in mechanism for remembering where the user came from, and so on. And that's in the end what we're telling the router here, use the built-in browser support. Simple as that. Now that's all we gotta do related to that. Now we can focus on those routes, because that's the heart of the router. Here we'll be able to tell the router which Vue component should be loaded for which URL, because ultimately that will be our goal. We want to load the teams component, let's say, when we're on our domain /teams, And we want to load the users component, let's say when we are on our domain/users. So let's work on registering routes and loading them next. So how can we register routes now? Well, we get this routes array, and here we now pass JavaScript objects to this array. And every object represents one route and the configuration for that route. And here, one very important option which we need to set on every route is the path option. This tells the router for which path, that's the part of the URL after the domain, a certain component should be loaded. For example, that we want to load a certain component for /teams, so that if our domain.com/teams is loaded, a certain component is loaded. And that's the second option we want to set here, the component option. Here we then define which component should be loaded by the view router when the user visits /teams. And in my case, that would be the teams list component here. Currently, I'm loading the teams list component here in app view with the dynamic component. I got my navigation, which emits a set page event. That happens when either of the two buttons is clicked in there. And then upon setting a page, the active page data property changes either to teams list or to users list. And that are my two components here, teams list and users list. The two components which I also registered here in my app component. And that simply then switches between these two components. This is a way of doing it, but it does not update the URL and it's not shareable. But it is the teams list component which I want to load here for this route. So in this main.js file, we now want to import teams list from /components teams.list.view. And then set component here equal to teams list, telling the view router that it's the teams list component that should be loaded if we visit /teams. And that's not the only route we want to load. Instead, I will duplicate this configuration here to also register a /users route. And here we want to load the users list component. So therefore, we now also import users list from components users list.view and load this for this /users route. And now we registered these two routes. Now the routes are configured, but a couple of things are missing to make this work. For one, at the moment this router is only stored in this router constant, but we're not doing anything with that constant. We need to make our view app aware of this router which holds these routes. And we do this by going to our app, and on this app we have the use method. This is a built-in method which in the end allows us to connect our view app with a third-party package with some other functionality. And here we simply pass the router to use. And this makes the view app aware of this router. Now that's a first step, but one important piece is still missing. The view app is now aware of these routes thanks to view router, and theoretically the view router sees that if we visit our domain /teams, we want to load this component. But it's missing one important piece of information. It doesn't know where to load this component to. At the moment, we're giving no hint at all to the router where this component should be rendered. And thankfully, it's not just taking the component and replacing everything on the screen with it. Instead, we need to use a special component to let the view router know where to render it. And we can replace this dynamic component with that new special component, since we're not going to use this dynamic approach anyways. So instead here, in app view, let's say inside of this main element, I want to render the selected route component. And to let view router know about this, we can use another component which is now built in. I'm saying now because it's built into view router and therefore only available because we're using the router in this view app. But since we do that, we now got a new built-in component, and that's the router view component. And that's in the end a placeholder telling view router that this is the place where the selected routed to component should be loaded. And we can, by the way, now also get rid of these two imports here, teams list and users list, in app view and not register them as components anymore, because we don't need to do that. We're not using these components in our template by using their selector. Instead, we select them here through the router. And if you do that, if you load a component through routing, you don't need to register this component additionally as a global or local component. You don't need to do that. So with that, we now let the router know where to load that, and hence we can save everything and reload. And we won't see anything on the screen because at the moment we're just on our domain /nothing. Now, the routes we registered were /teams and /users. So let's try those. Let's enter localhost 8080/teams, and we see the teams page. Let's try users, and we see the users page. And now we got shareable links. But of course, our navigation isn't working anymore. And that's definitely not what we want. We want to make sure that we can still navigate from inside the page and that we don't have to enter the different URLs manually. Nobody uses web pages like that. So let's see how we can navigate around with routes then. So now with our routes registered, let's make sure we can also reach those routes from inside our application. And we got this navigation.view file where I got two buttons where I emit a custom event to which I previously listened here in app view. I'm still listening to it, but actually now we're not going to navigate like this. We now don't need to manage manually which page should be loaded. We can get rid of the active page data property in app view. We can get rid of this event listener here on the navigation, and therefore we can also get rid of this setActivePage method here, of course. We can get rid of the entire methods block, therefore. In that navigation, we no longer emit setPage. And we therefore no longer have this setActivePage method, and we can hence get rid of the entire methods here. And therefore, actually, we can get rid of the entire script block since we got no specific component configuration in there anyways. Instead, we'll now navigate differently. And we'll not use a button anymore. Instead, we'll use another built-in component that comes with the view router. And that is the router link component. It's a little bit like the built-in anchor tag HTML element, you could say, but it's a special anchor tag. A special anchor tag which actually will not load a different page and reload the entire app and hence lose the current state, but instead a special anchor tag where the browser default of loading a different page is prevented, and instead the view router takes over, analyzes the link the user clicked, and then loads the appropriate component and updates the URL. Things like that are handled by router link. You can still pass your text between there. You can actually pass any HTML element in there, which you might need, because router link internally uses slots. But here I just want some text. And now, of course, we need to configure router link. And the most important configuration here is the to prop, which it expects. The to prop takes various different values, and the simplest way of using it is to provide a string to it which holds the path you want to go to. So in this case, /teams. So of course that should be one of the routes you are supporting in your routes configuration. And that's already all then. We can also replace the second button with such a router link. Here I want to go to my users, and hence the to prop points at users. Now we'll get some problems with styling here, because previously I used a button, now it's a link. Hence I will replace the button CSS selector down there with an anchor tag, because router link under the hood will render an anchor tag, so we can style an anchor tag here. And I'll delete this font CSS property, keep the rest though, and also replace button hover and button active with an anchor tag. Also add a new CSS property to the anchor tag rule here and set text decoration to none. With that styling updated, if we save this and reload, we got the same buttons as before, but now these are actually links. And if we click them, we switch between these different routes. And if we inspect these elements, we see what I just explained in theory. We got anchor tags here, which have this ref attribute, but this router link component actually makes sure that the browser default is prevented and the browser doesn't really try to load a different HTML file, but instead the router then analyzes the value in the ref attribute and checks your routing config to find the appropriate view component that should be loaded. In addition, you see that some CSS classes were added here, router link active and router link exact active. And we only have this on Teams at the moment. If I inspect the other list item, we don't have the classes there. These classes are added automatically by ViewRouter on the link which is currently selected, so for the route that's currently active, so that you can actually style these links based on the selection to give the user feedback regarding the route he or she is currently on. Now that's something we're going to explore next. Now let's use these special CSS classes which are added by router link to the created anchor tag. And for that here in the navigation.view, I will actually add a new selector here to this hover and active rule. And that is an anchor tag which has the router link active class on it. So a.router-link-active. This tells CSS that I want to apply these styles to every anchor tag which has this CSS class on it. And if I do that and save this, you now notice users is highlighted. If I click on Teams, that stays highlighted. And that's how you can reflect on your page visually on your links which link is currently active. Now, as a side note, you have two classes on there, router link active, which I'm using for styling here, but also router link exact active. Now, the difference is that router link active would also be applied to this item here if we had something like Teams team ID. So if we had some nested route to this route here. Now, we haven't learned about nested routes yet, so for the moment we can just ignore that. But the difference is that router link exact active will only be applied to the navigation item that's fully matched by the current path, whereas router link active will be applied to any navigation item which contains a part of the currently active route. At the moment, we have no situation where we would have nested routes, so at the moment it's either both or nothing, but later we'll see the difference in action. For the moment, it's just important to be aware of these classes which help you style your application. You can also change those default classes in case you're not happy with them. In main.js, where you create the router, you got more config options, and you got a link active and a link exact active class option, where you can use any other CSS class name you might want to use instead of the router link active class, which would be the default. So if you want to go with just active, for example, you could override this here. And I'm doing that here so that we see it in action. I'm setting the active class to just active, and that means I need to change my styling here and select the anchor tag with the active class on it. And with that, it still works, and now you can tell it's the active class besides the router link exact active class that's being added. So you can configure things like that. But with that, let's move on and let's not focus too much on the styling here. Instead, let's dig a bit deeper into the router and learn more about the different options we have here and the different kinds of routes we can register. I want to come back to this navigation here. We're currently using router link to have a way of getting to different parts of our page here from inside our app. So to have different links that lead to different pages. This is a very common way of navigating around. Sometimes, though, you also need to navigate programmatically. Let's say, for whatever reason, on the users list page here, above this unordered list, you had a button where I say confirm. So this is a button, not a link. We see it here. Now it's obviously totally unstyled, but it's good enough for what I want to show you. Let's say upon clicking this button, you want to run some code. So we have a method here in our methods option, confirm, input, whatever. And here you do something. You store some data in a variable, you send some data to a server, you're doing something important. And once you're done with that, you want to change the page. This is actually a common scenario that you want to navigate away once some task finished. Here it's just a dummy example, but in bigger apps you could have real use cases where a form is submitted, and once it is submitted, you want to navigate the user away from there. It's also something we'll see in action later in the main course project. So here we don't want to use a link because we don't just want to navigate away, we also want to do something else. Hence we have a button which triggers our confirm input method here upon a click. There we then do our important stuff, but then at the end, we want to navigate away. So we want to navigate away programmatically. We don't have a link on the page which the user clicks, but we want to trigger the navigation from inside the JavaScript code, from inside our component config object. How can we do this? Since we're using the router here on our Vue app, we have a special property available in our component config objects. We can access it through the this keyword, and there we have $router available. $router is available because we added the router package. And on this router, we now got various methods which we can use. For navigating programmatically, we, for example, got the push method to push a new route onto this routing history. So simply to add a new route to this routing memory the browser keeps. And push, in the simplest form, takes a string, which again has just the path in it to which we want to go. So /teams, for example. And if I do that and save this and reload, I can click confirm, and you see we go to /teams then, because of push. Now there also are other methods on the router which you can access. For example, you got back or forward to basically emulate the back and forward buttons in the browser. And you got more methods which you of course can find in the official docs. But here we need push for programmatic navigation. So with that, if we click this confirm button, we're taken to the Teams page programmatically. And for any cases where you have some code that should execute before you want to navigate, programmatic navigation with the $router is your friend. So now we added navigation in different forms. It's time to explore more things we can configure here on our route configurations. And there's one especially important feature which you need in many apps which you're going to build. We get this team members component here, right? And in this team members component, I want to render the different members of a team we selected. Now at the moment, this is kind of a dummy component which we're not even using. It has some built-in dummy data and we're not rendering this component anywhere. Now a common scenario, which you have in many apps, is that you might have another route here for a path of /teams, but now not just that path. We already have a route for that, and you should only have one route per path. Instead, we use /teams/ and now we want to have some dynamic ID here, so that we support paths like teams T1 if T1 would be a team ID, or T2. And we would load the same component with different data for these different teams. So we need a dynamic route with a so-called route parameter. And that's a feature supported by the Vue router. You can define a dynamic path segment by adding a colon and then any name of your choice, for example, team ID. Now that means that this route will become active if the user enters /teams and then anything thereafter. Therefore, the order matters, by the way. If you had another route here, /teams/new, so not a dynamic segment, but simply the text new, you should put this first, because otherwise this path here, this route, would match this route as well, because new would be interpreted as a team ID. Now we don't need the new route here, I just wanted to make you aware of this and make you aware of how these different routes will be parsed and prioritized. Here we don't need this new route though, but we want to set up this dynamic route here with the dynamic route parameter. So here I want to load a component, and the component that should be loaded is a component we need to import, the team members component from /components teams team members.view. That's the component that should be loaded here. And with that, if we now save this, we can enter teams/t1 and we load this component. The same for anything here. It's always the same component because anything after teams/ will be interpreted as a value for this dynamic segment. Now at the moment it's always the same component with the same dummy data, but now we can change this because we will get access to this concrete value which is used for this route parameter, for this placeholder here. We can get access for the concrete value the user entered inside of the component that is being loaded, so inside of team members. I don't want to use my dummy team data here. Instead, we do have dummy team data for all teams defined in app view. Here we got teams and we got users. And for every team we have a list of members. Now my idea is simple. When one of these 3 supported team IDs is being entered here in the URL after teams as a value for this route parameter, I want to load the appropriate team, find out which members we have in that team, and also load the appropriate users. Now we are already providing teams and users here in app view, so we can inject both in team members, and we'll need to do that so that we get access to that data. So here I will add inject and inject users and teams. Now we just need a way of getting access to this dynamic segment the user entered, so to the concrete value that was entered for this route parameter. And we could do this in the created lifecycle hook. That will be called when the component is created before it's shown on the screen, but once all the data is available. So here in created, we can now get access to the injected data, but also, and that's the good thing, to our routing data. And for this, we got another special property which is available. We saw $router, which gave us access to the overall router. We also have $route, so without an R at the end. The route is available in this component because this component is loaded through the router. And then the route gives us access to various pieces of information. For example, to the path that was responsible for loading this page, which in this case would be something like /teams and then the concrete team ID. So we could parse the team ID from that path, but we don't even have to do that. We have another property available, the params property. This holds all the route parameters that were used for getting to this page. And in this case, we have one route parameter for this page. Everything that starts with a colon here is a route parameter. And the name you chose here will be the name by which you can extract the value provided by the user. So in my case, the name is team ID, and hence here in team members, I can access params.teamID. If you chose a different name in your routing config here after the colon, you have to use the same different name here. So with that, we got our team ID, and I'm storing it in an extra constant, and we can now use the team ID to find the correct team in this injected teams array. So here I got the selected team, let's say, by accessing teams, this.teams, so the injected teams array, and then there the find method, which is a built-in array method, which needs a function that executes on every array element, which gets the team for which it's currently running as an argument, and it will run for all the teams in there, and which should return true if it's the team we're looking for, and that would be the case if the team ID is equal to the team ID we got here. So this helps us select the right team. Of course, we might have entered an ID which doesn't exist, but let's ignore this case for now. And let's instead then, once we got a team, find the members in there. Now for that, of course, in every team, we got the members key, which holds IDs of members we find in users. So we got our members by accessing selected team.members. But now we want to reach out to users and find the full user entries for those members, because members is just an array full of IDs. And for that, I will write a simple loop here. I will have my selected members here, which is an empty array initially. Then I go through all the members of my members array, which is this array full of IDs. And I will then reach out to my users, so to this injected users array, for every member ID I got, and find the user where the user ID is equal to member. Keep in mind, member is just another user ID, because we have a bunch of user IDs in members. This then is my selected user, or at least one selected user, so I add it to selected members by pushing it onto this array, like this. So this goes through all the member IDs we got for the given team, and we then select the user, the full user object for every user ID we got in our team, and then I add it to selected members, so that selected members then is an array full of full user objects. Well, and that's then something I want to store in a data property here, because I need the team name and a members data property in my template. So we'll add both here. Team name initially is an empty array, an empty string I mean, and members is an empty array. And then here in created, I set this members, so my data property, equal to my selected members I got here, so to this array filled with the concrete member objects. And I set this team name equal to selected team, and then on every team we got a name property, so I can access dot name here. And with that, if we save this, if we enter something like teams T1, I see nothing because I have an error here. Cannot read property push of undefined. Yeah, here it's not this selected members in this for loop. It's just selected members because this is a local constant. My bad. So selected members.push is correct here. And with that, if you then reload, this looks better. And now I see Max Schwartz and Praveen Kumar for team T1. For T2, I see different members. And for T3, I also see different members. So now this works. Now, of course, it would be nice if we could not just get there by manually entering a URL, but for example, by clicking these buttons on the Teams page. And therefore, that's what we're going to work on next. And for that, we should go to this Teams list component. And there we see it's the Teams item which is being rendered, which holds this button, which turns out to be a link. And this link currently is a regular anchor tag, and I instead want to use what? A router link that reaches to this route, but of course, where the ID of the team is different for every different team item. So we're going to replace the anchor tag with router link here, like this. And now set the to property to what? Previously it was just /teams, but now it needs to be /teams and then the ID, but the ID is different for every team's item. Well, first of all, we should get the ID as a prop here. So I will add ID as a prop so that we have it available inside of the team's item component. Because without having the ID of a team, it will be hard to construct the correct link here. So in teams list, where I loop through my team's items, I will actually bind ID to team.id so that we have the ID available in this team's item component. But with that, we still need to build this link. And we can do this because to does not just have to be set like this. You can also bind it to a dynamic value with the bind or the shorthand :to. And now this points at a JavaScript expression or simply at a data property, whatever you have. And here we could then derive the full path we want to go to by combining /teams, which is a string here with single quotes, since this is now a JavaScript expression, / and then plus ID. This constructs this URL, this path, where ID is different for every usage of team's item, so for every usage of this component. And hence, if I now save this and we reload, we got different links here, which lead us to the different team members. So that is working. And of course, we could now also take this and outsource it from inside our template here into a computed property to have less logic in a template and have our team members link computed property here, for example, where we return this generated URL, and then here we point at team members link. That, of course, is 100% optional. So with that, if I reload, this still works. Route parameters are useful, but they also can be tricky. There are various aspects you should be aware of, which you might or might not want to change or take care about. Here's one gotcha which you could face in an application. We don't face it here, but I can add it so that we do face it. Let's say on team members, so on the component we load for this route with the parameter, let's say in there we actually, for whatever reason, have another router link which says go to team 2, which always goes to /teams/t2, which is the ID of the team 2. Now, this is a very constructed scenario, but you could absolutely have an app where on the page that was loaded for a given parameter, you want to go to the same page with a different value for that parameter. And that's what I'm trying to emulate or to simulate here. So if I save this, we got this go to team 2 link here. Now, if we are on the page for team 2, of course, this does nothing. But if we are on the page for team 1, oh, this also does nothing. And that's the gotcha I'm talking about. If you are on the page that was loaded for a dynamic parameter, if you then want to go to a different page, so with a different value for this parameter, which in the end, of course, is kind of the same page, at least the same view component, you face this problem here. Now, you should be aware that if I go to team 1, we have T1 in the URL, and if I then click this link, this does change to T2, but the data on the screen doesn't update. Is this a bug? Well, it's not a bug, it's an intended behavior. The view router does not destroy and rebuild the components that were loaded when you navigate around. It's more efficient to cache them than to always destroy and rebuild them when the URL changes. But that's the problem here. I'm loading my data for the team members in created, and this is called when this component is, well, guess what? Created. Now, as I just said, the view router does not destroy and recreate the component just because the URL changed. Therefore, the code in created does not run again when the URL changed. Hence, if you are on the page which you now want to load again, but with different data, with a different parameter, by default, the view router will do nothing. That's of course not what we want here. How can we react to this changed URL? Well, in the end, when the URL changes, one other important thing changes. This $route property. It holds the latest information about the loaded route, and it will update when the URL changes. So this $route object will always hold the latest parameter, for example. And therefore, you can add a watcher here, and you can watch $route here. So this built-in property, you can watch that for changes. And this watcher will now run whenever the route changed. So here you get the new value then, the new route you could say. And in here, we can now run this logic again. So therefore, to not duplicate the code, I will actually add methods here. Load team members. And put my code in there. And call load team members here in created manually. And also call it here in my watcher. So that I load this method and run this method, which loads my team members when the component is created, but also when route changed. Now, one thing I want to do here, though, I want to pass my new route as an argument to load team members. And here, when we call it in created, I'll pass this $route. So I want to pass the route object as an argument and edit the method a little bit so that we get our route object here, and I will replace this route with just route. It's not a must do, but I want to do it here so that we get the route from outside, so to say, seen from inside this method, and we pass it as an argument when we call the method. With that, if I save this and reload, our links here on the Teams page still work. But if I click on Go to Team 2, now this page updates because now we're watching changes on the route. And this is just one way of making this work, though. It's a perfectly fine way, but it's not the only way, because there is another problem you could face here, or another thing about this team members component you might not like. Let's see what that is. Our team members component has one potential disadvantage. It's now only loadable through routing. Why? Because in the code, we rely on $route in the end. We use it here in created and we watch it here. So if you would use this component by simply embedding it in the template of another component, let's say you change your application and you now suddenly want to use this differently, or you use it in different places, one time loaded through routing, another time used through its tag in the template, then this would be problematic. It might be better if team members would be loaded such that you get props, that you simply get your team ID as a prop. That's how you would build this component if it would not be loaded through routing. You would get the team ID through props, and in all the places where you need the ID, instead of using this $route, you use this team ID, referring to that prop. And here you could then watch this prop for changes, for example. And then we would get our new ID here, would maybe forward that to load members, and we would change the load members code here to not expect the route as an argument, but the team ID. And therefore, we now just got team ID as an argument here, and we can delete that old first line. But if we save that, it won't work. We see nothing on the screen for /t2. And if we open the developer tools, we see that the problem is that we cannot read the property members of undefined. And the reason should be obvious. Team ID is expected as a prop, but we're loading this through routing. And the router by default doesn't add any props to this loaded component. But that's something you can change. In your route config, here on this route, which is the route responsible for loading the team members component, you can add another option. You can add the props option and set this to true. And this does one important thing. It tells the view router that the dynamic parameters should be passed into this component as props rather than just on the $route property. So now you will have a prop of the name you defined here after the colon, in my case team ID. The value, which is now part of the URL, will now be passed in as a prop into this component when it's loaded. So with props true, if you save that and reload, now this works again. And now we have one advantage. Now this component, team members, is more reusable, because now we can use it anywhere as long as we provide this prop. It's not strictly tied to routing anymore. So this is simply an alternative which you could consider when it comes to routing and loading components through routing. You can make your components more reusable by using props instead of $route. And even if you don't plan on using the component anywhere else, you might prefer getting your data through props than having to search for it in the $route parents property. Now in this demo app we've been working on thus far, we actually have one problem. Teams works, users works, and we can view our team's members. But in reality, most users would probably reach this page by just entering your domain. And if you do that, you don't have an error, but you also don't see anything on the screen. The reason for that can actually be seen in the console. The router doesn't find any matching route for /nothing, so for just our domain /nothing. And that's not a technical error, but it might not be what you intended. You definitely might want to handle this and display something on the screen. Now, it of course depends on the kind of app you're building and which routes you want to have. Maybe you have some component which you want to show here. Maybe you simply want to show the team's list if the user enters /nothing. But here, I want to have /teams in the URL when team's list is shown, simply to kind of have an expressive URL, which is also describing the type of content we're seeing on the page. Of course, I still want to add a new route here as a first route, which is path /nothing, which should be responsible for loading team's list as well. Now, as I just said, we can also load team's list here, save this, and now see our teams also when we visit /nothing, and everything will work. But I always want to have /teams in the URL and not just /nothing for loading the team's list. So therefore, actually what I want to do here is I don't want to load the team's list component. Instead, I want to redirect to this route. And that's possible with the router. In the route config, you have another option which you can set on a route, and that's the redirect property. And you can set this to a path you want to redirect to, so that if /nothing is entered, we redirect to teams. And of course, you can redirect to any path you want. And if I save this, and I now enter my domain /nothing, if I hit enter, you see it changes to /teams, and we're redirected to this page by the view router. So that's a pretty nice feature, being able to redirect. It is something which you might need a lot in your applications. There also is kind of an alternative to redirect. You can also set the alias option. Well, you would actually not set it here, Instead, you would remove this route and go to the route you want to load when this route is loaded, and then add alias to that. So in this case, the /teams route. And here you then add your alias path, which in the end should lead to the same component. So here /nothing would be an alias for /teams. If you do that and you enter /nothing, we still load the team members component. So it's a bit like defining /nothing with component teams list as we did it a couple of minutes ago. With alias, you can write this in a shorter form. But of course, the downside, which I don't want to have here in this use case, is that the URL doesn't change. And that's the difference to a redirect. With a redirect, the URL is changed. You are really redirected to a different path. With an alias, the URL does not change. You just load the same component as on a different route. And it depends on your requirements and your application which behavior you want. I don't want an alias here. Instead, I want to redirect as I did it before. I want to redirect to /teams, save everything, and therefore make sure that when I enter nothing, I end up on /teams. Another thing which we're not handling in this demo here is the use case that the user enters any route which is not supported. So here /something. If I enter this, again, we see nothing because we have no route defined for that. Now, of course, we can't define routes for all possible values that could be entered here. There is an infinite amount of paths the user could enter. That's why you can define catch-all routes. So here, I'll add a new route at the end because it should have the lowest priority and only kick in if no other route handles this. But here, the path should be / and then something which tells the router that anything should match this route. And for that, you add a dynamic segment, then any name of your choice, for example, not found or catch all, whatever you want. I'll go with not found. And then brackets, and in the brackets .star. This certainly looks strange, but in the end, this means it's a dynamic segment, and this here is actually a regular expression. This syntax is supported by the Vue router, and it simply means any character combination which is being used as a value here should in the end lead to this route being loaded. That's why this needs to come last, otherwise it would also override the other routes which we want to have. But if none of these routes is handling the entered path, this route should kick in. And now here you can define which component should be loaded in this case. Or if you want to redirect. For example, we could redirect to /teams for any invalid value that's being entered. So if I save this and I enter something, I'm redirected to /teams. Alternatively, you create a not found component, let's say here in the nav folder, with a simple template where I say page not found, maybe view our, and then a router link, teams, and close the h2 tag, and then here point at /teams. That could be our not found page. And now we could load this component, which just has a template because it doesn't need more. You could add styling, but I want to keep it simple. And we could load this component now by importing it here into our main.js file, not found, from components, nav, not found.view, and point at that component here on this not found route, like this. And if we do this and save everything, if I enter some unsupported path here, we see our not found page where we can go back to Teams. So that is how you can handle any invalid input the user might provide. It should come last so that it doesn't override your other routes, but then it's really useful. And together with the redirect feature, this allows you to have full control over where the user of your website is going under which circumstances. there are more things you can configure when it comes to your routes which you set up on your router. For example, we have this pretty nice feature of nested routes. In some applications, you might want to have, you could say, a router inside of another router. Let me give you an example. Let's say our team members should not be loaded on a new standalone page, but instead when I click View Members here, I want to load the members for that team above that list of teams. So on the same page, I want to embed my members of that team. That's something which you might want to do. And that's something which is possible with the View router. We got this route here, which is responsible for loading our team members, and currently it's a standalone route defined next to the teams route, basically, on the root level of all our routes. These routes are all on the same level. They're siblings to each other. Now you can set up a nested route by going to the route where you want to nest routes inside and adding the children option on the route config. Children takes an array, and it takes an array of routes. So the same routes we set up here in routes are added to children. So here on teams, we can now take this route and move it in there. And now I reformatted this to make it a bit easier to read. So now inside of my teams route, I have a child route, which is this one. And here you don't need to repeat the entire path. You can just add the segments which should go after this segment, so after /teams. And you can have more than one route in here. If you had multiple routes that should be nested inside of teams, you could absolutely add them there. Here I just needed one route though, but this route will now be reached with teams / and then some ID like T1. And now what's the difference with having a nested route? Well, one difference is that if I save this, if I click View Members, now we don't load our team members route anymore. And the reason for that is that View, the View router to be precise, doesn't know anymore where to load this. Because now the team members route, this one here, is no longer a root route. It's no longer registered directly inside of routes. It's a child route of another route. Now, the router view component, which we use in app view, is our topmost router view component we have in this entire app, and it's only responsible for the root routes. So for the routes directly registered in the routes array. So this child route cannot be rendered into this router view. Instead, you now need to add a second router view in the component where this route is defined as a child component. So in this case, in our team's list component, that's the component which has this as a child route. So it's the team's list component where you now need to add an extra router view for all the child routes. In this case, for the one child route we got. So in team's list, above the unordered list, for example, we can now add another router view. And this router view will now be important for all the child routes of the team's list component route, so of this route. Hence, now if I go back to teams and reload, we see nothing because it's just /teams. But if I click on View Members, now we see our members for that team. And if I change the team here, you see that updates up there. And of course, we can do this for all the teams. And that's another nice feature, having these nested routes. You will also notice that with the nested route, if my URL changes to that nested route, Teams is still highlighted up there. It wasn't before, if you recognize that. Before, where this route was a separate root route as a sibling to the Teams route, before, even though that route also started with /teams, this link was not highlighted because the active class is only applied if the currently loaded path is actually related to the path this link points at. And this link points at /teams. /teams T1 is now a nested route on this team's route, and therefore, whenever some nested route is active, this link is treated as active. That's why now the active CSS class is being added here. But that's just an extra side note related to nested routes. And nested routes can be a really useful feature for building complex user interfaces where you want to load different parts, maybe nested in different components based on different URLs and paths. And that's exactly what we're doing here. So now we learned about nested routes. Now imagine a bigger Vue application where you have dozens or maybe even hundreds of different routes, some routes deeply nested in other routes. You can also have multiple levels of nesting. You could have children here on this nested route as well. So imagine an application where you have a lot of such nested routes. If you have such an app, constructing links like we're currently doing it, like this, can quickly become cumbersome. You always have to add the full path here and build it out like this. You have to build such a long string which describes the path you want to navigate to. Now, because this can get cumbersome, the Vue router offers two very useful features which make building such links, which we pass to router link, more convenient. The first useful feature which we have is the fact that the toProp on router link does not just take such a string link. It does take that, but not just. Besides passing such a string which holds the path, you can also use an object as a value for to. For that, of course, you need to bind to dynamically with a colon. And then this object may have various options that allow you to describe the route you want to load. In this object, you can set a path property. And that then takes a string which could be /teams plus this ID. So what we returned as a string before. Now, by just doing that, we of course don't gain much. We basically do what we did before, but now inside of an object. This gets more useful if we combine it with another nice feature the Vue router offers. And that would be named routes. We can assign a name to every route which we have, simply by adding a name property to the route config. Here, for example, we could name the route teams. We could name this nested route here as well. Team-members maybe. The names are totally up to you, they just should be strings. So now I assigned two names, and of course you can assign names to any routes you want. And now we can leverage that name, team members. Back in the team's item component, now instead of setting the path property, which we can do, we can set the name property on this route location object, which we pass to. And here we can use team-members, for example, making it clear that this router link should load this nested route. Of course, this route has a dynamic segment, so we should also set this. And we do that by adding a second property to this object, which describes the destination we want to go to. And that's the params property. Params takes an object where you now can set up your params as key value pairs. And of course, I mean the parents which are expected by the route with that name. So in this case, that team member's route wants a team ID param, because that's the name we chose here as a dynamic segment. Hence here, we can add team ID in this nested object, which we provide to params, and then set our value here to this ID. Now, arguably, that's a bit more code than before, but it actually has two great advantages, I would say. It's very readable and maintainable, and it has one extra huge advantage. If you ever should decide that you want to go with a different path, let's say team instead of teams, then you don't need to go to this team item component and update the path everywhere where you used it. Instead, the name didn't change, so you don't need to update anything here, and you can still conveniently change the path how often you want. That's why navigating by name instead of by path might be a useful pattern especially, of course, in bigger applications where you use a route in a lot of different components. You then don't have to update all those components whenever you decide to change the path. And that's why passing such an object instead of a string to can be useful. By the way, you can provide the same object to this router push in case you should be navigating programmatically. You can provide the same kind of object to this push method, but that's just a side note. And if I do that and save everything and reload, our links here therefore still work fine, and I can load different team members now by passing this object to. And the view router will analyze this object, compare it to your route setup, and create the correct anchor tag with the correct link to the to-be-loaded route and therefore component. This object form of describing the location or the destination of a link can also be useful for other things, not just for using names and setting up a link in a more convenient way instead of building a long string, but also to maybe add extra information which you might need. Let's say you want to use a query parameter. In case you're not sure what that is, a query parameter is that thing you see in some routes, in some URLs after the question mark, like sort equals ascending. A query parameter is basically an optional route parameter which is not needed to find and load a component, but which may be used to then pass extra information into that component. It's not a must use, but it can be useful in some apps and some pages. Now, you could add such a query parameter if you build your link manually by simply adding it to your string which you're building, like this. But if you use this object form, it's even more convenient. You can add a query property next to name and params to this config object, and query then takes a nested object just as params did. And here you can add any query parameters you might want to pass to the to-be-loaded page, like sort with a value of ASC, a string saying ASC. I'll reformat that to make it a bit easier to read. And you can add any query parameters you want, and of course your page, your component supports. These query parameters are not defined in the route config. You don't need to add anything here because they're optional by nature. But now if I save that and we reload, if I click view members, you see that query parameter is added to the URL automatically. Now we're not doing anything with that parameter here, but we are adding it. And if you would want to use it in the component that is loaded through that query parameter, so in this case team members, you can extract it. There you get access to your query parameters, if I console log it, through this route.query. The query property holds information about your query parameters. So if I save that and reload and open the console, we see we get an object here which has this sort key and a value of ascending. So that is how you get access to the query parameters you might be passing to a component through routing. As a side note, query parameters are not provided as props. If I log this.sort here, hoping that we get a sort prop, since we have a sort query parameter, you will see that the value I get here is actually undefined. It's undefined because query parameters are just accessible through $route. This shouldn't be a problem though, because query parameters are optional anyways. So if you ever use your component in a different way, so not by routing but by embedding it in another component's template, you might simply not have access to that query parameter, but since it is optional anyways, and it might not be added to the URL as well, your code should be prepared to handle the non-existence of this query parameter anyways. But that's it for query parameters here. I wanted to bring it up because it is important to be able to work with those as well. It is important to know that view router makes adding and extracting them easy. We don't need them for this dummy application, but you might need them for other applications, of course. With all the knowledge we gained over the last lectures, we are nearing the end of this module now. You now know pretty much all the key features you have to know about registering routes, loading components, and navigating. But there are two other nice features which can help you provide the user experience you want to provide. And that will be controlling the scroll behavior of your pages and navigation guards. Now let's start with controlling the scrolling behavior. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say we're on the Teams page, we load our team here, and then I scroll down so that I can load the client consulting team. If I click that, of course the component updates, but I have to scroll up there to see that. Maybe we want to scroll up there automatically when we switch the route here. That could be something we might want to do. In general, maybe, whenever we switch a route, we want to scroll to top so that the user always sees the full new page and isn't stuck somewhere down the page. And that's something we can add with the View router. In main.js, where we create our router, besides registering all those routes and then setting some global config like the link active class, you can also add a scroll behavior property. That scroll behavior property actually is a method. A method which will be called by the View router whenever your page changes. And this scroll behavior method will then receive three arguments automatically: a to, a from, and a saved position argument. Now you can name them however you want, but that is what will be in there. But what is to, from, and saved position? Well, let's simply log this. Let's log to, from, and saved position. And save this. Now I reload and I click on a link here. And you see I get this logged to the console. Actually, we already got it when I first loaded this page. To and from in the end are route objects. To and from basically are what you also get with this route inside of a component. To and from are the pages we're going to and we're coming from. So when I first load this page, the page we're going to is having this full path, which this path without the query parameter and so on. It has this params object, the query object, and this is exactly the kind of object you would get with this $sign route inside of the component that is loaded. And we're coming from this path. It's pretty much all empty because I just loaded the page. If I clear the console and I click a link, you see this looks different. Now we're going to this path with a parameter of t2, and the route we're coming from has a parameter of t1. And saved position is null here because saved position is only set if you're using the back button. Then you see saved position is actually an object with a left and a top property describing where the user scrolled to when this page you just went back to was left. So for example, if I scroll all the way down and I go to a different page and I go back, then this scroll position, which is saved here, is the scroll position I had when I left this page before I clicked the back button. Now, how can this all be useful? Well, this scroll behavior method should return an object describing where the browser should scroll to upon the page change. And here, the object you return should have a left and a top property. So just as the saved position has it when it is available. And if you, for example, set left to 0 and top to 0, that means that you want to scroll all the way to the top of the page. So if I always return this, and I, for the moment, still console log to, from, and saved position so that my IDE doesn't complain about these being unused. So if I log that, but we always return this object, the effect is that if I scroll down and switch to a different page, we jump to the top. And that's exactly the behavior I want here. Now, of course, on the other hand, if we go back, I might want to go back down here so that I really go back not just to the page we're coming from, but also to the place on the page we were on. And that's now where the saved position comes in handy, because that is saving the exact place we were scrolled to. So we can tweak this and check if saved position exists, so if it is not null, and if that's the case, we return the saved position. So that, for example, if we do go back, we use the saved position instead of jumping to the top. But if saved position does not exist, we do jump to the top. And with that, if I save that and reload, I can go to my teams, load a team, scroll down, jump to the top. But if I now click back, I'm scrolled down again. And that can, of course, enhance the user experience, because now we scroll the user to the place where he or she is able to see exactly the content that we want to present at this moment. The last feature I want to explore in this module with you is the feature of navigation guards. Navigation guards can be useful if you add features like authentication, where you, for example, want to avoid that a user is able to access a certain route if he or she is not authenticated. But they can also be useful to simply be aware of changing pages in case you want to run some code there, or they can be useful to ensure that a user doesn't accidentally navigate away from a page where he or she has unsaved edits in a form, for example. We'll see practical examples for guards in the course project, but of course, since this is the introductory module to routing, I'll start showing you all those guards in this module already. Now, what exactly do I mean when I say guards? I'm talking about functions, methods, which are called automatically by ViewRouter when a page changes, or to be precise, when a navigation action started. For example, on the router we're creating in main.js, on this main router, before we pass it to our View app, we can call before each, like this. Before each is a built-in method, and it wants a function as an argument. Before each wants a function as an argument. And this function will be called by the ViewRouter whenever we navigate from one page to another. Before each navigation action, this function will be called. And this function will then receive 3 arguments from ViewRouter. To, which is the route object of the page we're going to, from, which is the route object of the page we're coming from, and next, which is a function which we have to call to either confirm or cancel this navigation action, because that's something we can do in navigation guards, which is why they are called guards. We can cancel a navigation if we're not happy with it. If we, for example, want to deny the navigation because the user is not authenticated. Now, how could this look like? First of all, I'm going to console log to and from so that we see what we're getting there, and then I'll call next like this, with no special setting. I will also console log global before each to make it clear that we're in this globally on the entire router registered before each hook. If I save that, reload and clear the console, and I go to users, we see global before each in the console, and then we see 2 logs. Now, one of these logs is coming from the scroll behavior, so to avoid confusion, I'll comment this out, and to avoid that my IDE complains about the unused to and from, I'll replace that with an underscore and underscore 2, which is basically an indicator that I have to take these arguments in order to reach the third one, but that I don't plan on using them. And that's something my IDE and my local setup will accept. So these are just argument names following a convention that signals to the setup that I need to use these arguments, but I don't plan on using them. So with that, if I reload and we switch from users to teams now, we see global before each and then one log with the to and the from route object. To, of course, is having the teams path because we're going to teams, and from has users. And other than that, we see nothing special. Because I just called next like this. And if you call next like this, you allow the navigation. You confirm it. You can also pass false to next though, and that will cancel the navigation. Let's try that. If I save that, we already see when I reload, there's nothing on the screen, because loading the page failed because I canceled this initial navigation. If I try to go to users, we get no error. We see our global before each method runs, but again, we see nothing on the screen, because with false, we canceled this. Now here, of course, that's not too useful because we're canceling all navigation here, but later in the course project, we'll also see how we could use that feature in combination with checking whether the user is authenticated or not to cancel or allow this. We also have a third option for next here. Besides passing nothing or false, we can also pass either a string or a location object in here. A string with a route we want to navigate to, which of course should then be one of the routes we registered up there, or such a navigation object which describes that, for example by using the name and then maybe setting up any parameters. Like here, I could make sure that every navigation action leads to a route with the name team members and the team ID set to T2. Which of course makes absolutely no sense, but I just want to show you how that works. However, make sure you don't save and reload here, because you would create an infinite loop, because even when we go to this route, because we redirect here, we would then again redirect us. So here we should then actually check if to path or to name is equal to team members. So if we are already going to the team members page, in which case I want to call next, and only else if we're going to a different page, I want to forward, I want to redirect to team members. And now we can save this and reload, and we now always end up on this teams T2 page if we tried to go anywhere else but to another team member. That would also work, but if I try to go to users, I still end up on teams T2 because of this global before each hook. Now, I will say it again, this of course is no logic that really makes sense in this demo project, but it is important that you understand how this navigation guard works, what the next method does in there, and how you can use it. With that, however, I'm going to comment this out and just call next like this to confirm the navigation so that we don't redirect us to just one kind of page. Instead, now we can navigate around as we're used to, but you now have a first idea of what a navigation guard is able to do. And as you might imagine, that can be useful if you want to check whether the user is authenticated and prevent access to certain page if he or she is not authenticated. That would be a typical scenario, which we are going to see later. Now we don't just have this global guard though. This before each function here will run on every navigation action, no matter which route is being used, no matter from which route we go to which other route. This will always run. Sometimes this is what you need, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you just want to protect individual routes. You could do this, of course, with a if check here, where you check your to and from route objects to also run different logic based on different routes. But you can also set up the before each navigation guard on single routes. For example, on users, let's say. For that, you simply go to your users route config, and here you can add before enter. Not before each, because now it technically is just one route. Before enter is a method here as well, and just as before each, it gets to, from, and next. So here I console log users before enter. and maybe also console log to and from if you want to, and then call next to confirm it, or do whatever you want to do with next. Next works just as I explained it on the global before each navigation guard. Here I'm just confirming every navigation to users. And now this will be called whenever we go to users. So if I save that and reload, if I go to users, we see global before each, because that still executes. After all, it executes for every navigation action. But we also see users before enter, and then the output of to and from for this page. To, of course, is pointing at the users page, because that before enter hook was registered for the users page. Now, in case you don't want to register this on the route level or in your route config, you can also add a new hook, a new method inside of your component. Let's say in the users list component. Here in your component config object, you can add all those view lifecycle methods like created or mounted, and you can also add the before route enter method. If you use the view router, which we do, this will be called before navigation to this component is confirmed. And here again, you get to, from, and next, and therefore we can do what we did before. We can console log users list component before route enter. We can then console log to and from, of course, and we can call next or run any logic we want to run to confirm or deny navigation to next or redirect the user. And with that, if I go to Teams, reload, clear the console, and go to users, we see global before each, and then to and from, users before enter, and then to and from, and then users list component before route enter. And that's the order in which these navigation guards execute. Global is always first, then the route config level, and then the component level. All of these hooks run before the route is confirmed though, which is why you can and have to call next to confirm it manually or deny it or redirect the user somewhere else. We got two other guards related to loading a component. One is the before route update guard, which you call directly inside of a component. To be precise, inside of components which are reused, which in our case would be the team members component. Here we got the parameter, the team ID parameter, and it's absolutely possible that we are on the page of one team and we load another team members page. And then this team members page never leaves the screen and hence is reused, as you learned. In such cases, view router will call another nice method in the component config object. Maybe here, next to created. There you can add the before route update method, and view will call this method whenever this component is about to be reused with new data because the route changed. So here we also get to, from, and next. And then you can also deny or confirm the navigation just as you know it, just as I explained it before on the global before each hook. It's the same here. And besides that, of course, you can utilize to and from, for example, to call load team members based on the new team ID param, which you get on the to be navigated to route object. Now, of course, we already have logic in place here to handle the changing team ID route parameter in this component, so we don't need before route update for that. But using before route update would be an alternative to watching the team ID prop, for example. Though, of course, with that hook, we again bind this component to be used with routing. We used props instead of route params to make this component more flexible. When we use this alternative, we would make it less flexible because this is only called if this component is loaded and reloaded through routing, of course. But now this would be an alternative, and with that we can console log team members component before route update here, and console log to and from if we want to, and then save everything. And now if I go to a different team, we see before route update runs, and well, then our logic in there runs, which we don't need here, but I want to show you this hook, of course. I'm going to comment this out though, because we are already loading team members when the team ID changes. We don't need to do this twice. But that is another navigation guard, or another navigation hook you could also call it, that is worth knowing. Now there is another global guard we can add on the router, and that is the after each guard. This also wants a function, and of course, as always here, it doesn't matter how you define the function, if you do it like this or as an arrow function. And this also gets the to and from argument, but not the next function, because after each will only run once a navigation has been confirmed. So in here, you can't change that anymore. You can't deny a navigation. You can only do this in the before hooks, in the before guards. The after each guard could be nice for sending analytics data to your own server, for example, to log every navigation action and log when a user changes pages. That's something you could do here. You don't use it to control what the user sees on the screen, because as I just said, it's too late here. You can just console log to and from, or send data to your server, as I said, but that's about it. So here I will console log global after each, and if I do that and save this, we see if I load that, global after each is the last thing we see on every navigation action. Now these are the guards related to coming to a page, which are called before a navigation action is confirmed. There also is a useful guard which is triggered when the user wants to leave a page. Of course, when you leave a page and go to another page, all the before guards are triggered, but maybe you also want to run some code on the component that is being left right before it's being left, and you possibly want to be able to deny the leave this page action there. Now what do I mean by that? Let's say on the users list component, we want to run code whenever this component is left. We could do this with the unmounted lifecycle hook view nose. If I log this here, this will be executed whenever we leave the user's page. So if I go to users and I leave to teams, you see unmounted here. But the problem is that this runs after the hooks, so after the navigation has been confirmed, and this gives us no way of canceling the navigation. Now, why might we want to cancel the navigation from inside the component which we're leaving? Well, let's say you had a form in there, and you want to make sure that until that form has been saved, you at least want to warn the user that there are unsaved changes which would be lost if the page is left. And we can simulate this with another button here, save changes, and a new data property. So for that, I'm adding data to this users list component. And there I have the changes saved property, which initially is false. And that's of course just some dummy code here. Then we could have a method, save changes, and in here I set this changes saved to true. And save changes should be triggered when this button here is clicked. So let's bind it to that. Again, this is all just some dummy code, just a small example. Now we want to make sure that as long as this is false, we at least get a warning that we don't accidentally leave the page. Because we all know that. You are on a page, you're entering something in a form, and accidentally we swipe to the right, and all the input is lost. Or we accidentally hit the back button on our mouse. So accidentally leaving a page where you entered something in a form is definitely something we all know. And that's exactly where another navigation guard can help us. Inside of a component, in the component config object, you can add the before route leave guard. You can add this if you're using the view router, and then the router will call this first before calling all the before each and before enter guards. Now here you also get to, from, and next, just as on the enter guards. But this will now be called first, and here we can of course console log users list component before route leave. And of course, we can also console log to and from to see what's inside of these route objects. But most importantly, we can now use next as you learned it to confirm the navigation or to only sometimes confirm it. For example, we can check if this changes saved is true. If that's the case, I want to call next, because if the changes are saved, the user may just leave the page. But if that's not the case, I want to ask the user whether he or she really wants to leave. For that, here in else, we can call the prompt function, which is built into the browser, which shows a built-in alert where the user has to choose yes or no. Are you sure you got unsaved changes is something we could ask here. The result of that is a boolean, which we could store in a user wants to leave constant. And then we call next and pass user wants to leave to that. And that's either true or false based on what the user chose in this alert will present to him or her. And if we pass true to next, that's just like calling next like this. It will confirm the navigation. If we pass false to next, this will cancel the navigation and the user will stay on the page. So let me show this to you. If we save that and I reload users, by default, changes are not saved. This is false by default. Hence, if I don't click Save Changes and I go to Teams, I'm now prompted whether I really want to go. And prompt was the wrong function here. I want to use confirm. Sorry. So let's use the confirm function and repeat this. I am on users, I reload, changes are not saved, and I want to go to Teams. And now I get this prompt if I'm sure. And if I click cancel, I stay on users. The same if I accidentally click the back button, I stay here. If I of course click OK, the navigation is confirmed and I am allowed to leave. But at least I get this warning, and if I accidentally clicked the back button or anything like that, I don't throw away all my unsaved changes, and that can dramatically enhance the user experience. Of course, if I click Save Changes, I can go without getting the warning, because then changes saved is true. And that is why the before route leave guard can be very useful for enhancing the user experience you provide to your users by making sure that they don't accidentally lose their input. Well, and these are the different navigation guards. They run at different points of time and in different places of your code. You can use the place that best fits your requirements, if you want to run a guard for every navigation or just for certain routes, for example. And with those guards, you can actually provide quite nice user experiences. Now, as I mentioned before, we'll see those guards in action soon in the course project we're building, and then this might make even more sense, but hopefully by now you already understand why we might want to use them, and more importantly, how they work. Here's another feature which can be useful, especially used in conjunction with navigation guards. And that would be route meta fields. On any given route in your route config, you can add an extra property, the meta property. Meta takes any kind of value, for example, an object, and you can store any kind of values in there. For example, needs of set to true. But this is entirely up to you. Why could this be useful? Well, you can access this meta field in all the places where the route object, the $route object, is available. And that's the case inside of components, and with that you could pass data into a component which is loaded for this route. But you can also use it in your navigation guards, because there you also got access to the to and from route objects. And you could then, for example, add meta like this to indicate that this route needs authentication, to then go to the global before each route and check if the route you're going to in its meta field needs auth, if that's truthy. And then here you could check whether the user is authenticated. For the moment I'll just log needs auth. But here you could then check whether a user is authenticated, and if that is the case, you confirm this, and otherwise you deny this. With that, you could use a global navigation guard that runs for every route to then still do different things based on the metadata attached to the different routes. And that is something which also can be useful to elegantly set up a global navigation guard that still does different things based on the metadata you attached to a route. It's an advanced concept, you'll definitely not need it all the time, but having this extra data which you can pass into a component and into this route object, more importantly, when a certain route is matched, can be useful at times. Now we know all the core and even some advanced features which you need to know about the view router and about routing. And we saw all those important features in action in this demo project. Now we're going to build a bigger project in the next module where all of that makes even a bit more sense, since we'll then have a more realistic project. Before we go there though, let's talk about organizing our different files and folders. Because at the moment I'm working with the components folder with my different feature areas and then the different components. Nothing wrong with that. But when you use routing, you could also argue that you don't just want to have components, but maybe also a pages or a screens folder. And I'll go with pages. This is optional, you don't need that. But you could then put the components which are loaded as pages through your router into the pages folder to have a clear distinction between the components which are loaded through the router and the regular components which you embed in your templates. Maybe you don't want this distinction. For team members, we for example ensured that route params are passed in as props, so maybe that should be usable as a regular component as well. But maybe you do want this distinction. And then of course we could move users list view and teams list view and also the not found page over into the pages folder, and also add the users footer and the teams footer there. And it's up to you whether you also want to use team members or not. Now we just need to update all the imports and import teams list from pages / teams list, users list from pages / users list, and so on. Do that for all those pages. And again, this is really optional, but it can make sense, especially in bigger apps, since it makes it easier to see which components will be loaded as pages through the router and which components will be used as components that are embedded into other components' templates. Now, with that, you don't just need to update all the imports in the main.js file, of course, but also any imports you have inside of your page components, because here the paths are now incorrect. We need to go up one level with 2 dots and a slash, then go into the components folder, and then here into users, user item.view. For teams list, I also need to update teams item, which I get from components. So going up one level, components, teams, and then teams item.view. And with that, that recompiles and works as before. But now the pages are organized in a separate folder. Again, it's up to you whether you want this, but I want to show this possible way of organizing components. Now, related to reorganizing our files and folders, you might notice that the main.js file gets rather big with all our routes in here. Now, this is of course a small app, but even with that, all the routing logic takes up quite a bit of space in here. Now, this is not bad per se, but it makes it harder to find the place where you actually create your app and so on. Hence, you might want to use a separate router.js file and actually move all the routing related code into that file. So grab all that code here and move it into router.js, except for the app import. And in main.js now get rid of all those other imports. And then take the router and all the routing logic, cut it from main.js, and add it here in router.js. And then at the very bottom, export router as a default so that we can import it into another file. Because we need to import it into main.js now. We can import a router from /router.js. And then we can still use router because we're importing it. But with that, everything will work as before, but our routing code is now in a separate file, and that makes our code overall more manageable and maintainable. Now that's it for the Vue router. You learned why we need routing and how to set up routing. You learned how to register routes, that there's a lot you can configure there. You can set up redirects, paths, names, metadata, multiple components that should be loaded, nested routes with children. We learned how to work with dynamic path segments to use route parameters which we can extract in the loaded components, how we can pass those route parameters as props into the to-be-loaded components, and much more. We learned about all those navigation guards and about controlling the scroll behavior. We learned how to navigate with router link or also programmatically with the $router property and the push method. We learned how we can describe the location we want to go to. For example, by setting up a string path to which we want to go, or by passing such an object using the name, adding params, and possibly adding a query parameter. With all of that, you can provide a great user experience. You can make sure that users don't lose unsaved changes. You can make sure that you have URLs and paths in the URLs that relate to the content that's visible on the screen. And you got shareable URLs, which you can copy and paste to load exactly that place of your Vue application, even though it's still a single-page application. These are all the things you learned here, and I can absolutely recommend that you go through this module again if some things aren't clear, or maybe in a couple of weeks, so that you make sure you don't forget all those things which you learned here. Because you will need the Vue router in any bigger application you're going to build. And speaking of that, we are going to build such a bigger application so that we can practice all the things we learned thus far and also see the router in action in a more realistic application. We now gained a lot of knowledge about important concepts and features which you need in Vue applications. There is one thing which is missing, which you don't need in any application, but which helps in a lot of applications. And that would be transitions and animations, moving things around and doing so in an animated way to help users understand your user interface, to provide a better user experience. Technically, transitions and animations are totally optional, but they often make your UI and UX much, much better. And therefore, in this module, we'll start by understanding transitions and animations, how they work and how you can make them work with CSS. We'll then learn how Vue.js can help us with animations and where exactly we need its help. And then we'll also see that animating lists is a bit different than animating other things, which we'll dive into first in this module, and therefore we'll cover this as well. Now, you know the game. Attached, you find a starting project, run npm install to install all dependencies we got in there. And once that is done and out of the way, you can run npm run serve to bring up that development server which hosts this demo app. Now, here's the app we'll be starting with, and to be honest, it's more of a playground than a real app. We got a modal here, which we can open and close, but it's really just there so that we can practice animations. But we'll not start with the modal, we'll start with this square, with this dark purple square here. And we'll see how we can animate that with CSS and also Vue. And then we'll also see where we need more support from Vue's side and how we get that support. So how can we animate things? Let's start simple. Let's say we want to click this animate button. And, well, then this square here, this block, should be animated. And for that, we can go back to our code, to app.vue, which is where I have this block, this div with the class block. And we'll start by adding a click listener to animate, so that we can write some Vue code that should do something with that div. And I want to start very, very simple. I want to start by simply moving that block a little bit to the left, let's say. To achieve this, we can add a new method. Animate block sounds like a fitting name for that. And that's the method which should be triggered upon a click. So let's wire this up. And I want to manage some data here, which basically controls whether we want to animate the block or not. So whether we clicked the button or not. Animated block is the data property I will add for that. And it's a simple boolean and starts with a false value. Now that's just one way of implementing this, but this is a very simple demo which we can build like this. So we got the animated block data property here in the app view file, and we can now utilize this data property to add a CSS class to this div conditionally, because we can animate things in web development with just CSS. We don't technically need JavaScript for it. We might just need JavaScript to start the animation, to add certain CSS code. But thereafter, CSS can do that on its own. So here, we could add a dynamic class binding to bind the animate class, let's say. This class name is up to you. Whenever animated block, so this newly added data property, is true. When that's true, the animate class will be added. And we can now define this animate class here in our styles. I'll add a brand new class, animate, and to move the block around, we can, for example, use the transform CSS property, which is a built-in CSS property, has nothing to do with Vue.js, and there we can add translate x to move an element around on the x-axis. And the transform property is perfect for that because it moves elements in an optimized way. It gives us great performance, essentially. So here we could move it by, let's say, 50 pixels. So now, to finish this up, we just need to go to this method we added before and set this animated block equal to true here. And with all of that, with that property, which we use to add the animate class dynamically, and that animate class defined down there. With all of that set up, if we save that, we can click animate and we see that block move a little bit. We can actually also move it a bit further by, for example, deducting 150 instead of 50 pixels. But what you'll see, of course, is that this is an instant jump. It's not an animation at all. It's just an instant jump to its new position. Now, this is not what I want here. I want a smooth animation. And implementing that is super easy with CSS. We can simply go to this block class, which is the base CSS class this div has. And on that block class here, we can add the transition CSS property, which is another built-in property CSS offers. It has nothing to do with Vue. The transition property takes a couple of values. It first of all wants to know which other CSS property we want to transition. For example, we could say that we want to animate the opacity. But here on this block, we're never changing the opacity, so this makes no sense. We can say all to animate any changes in any animatable CSS properties. Or we target transform specifically, since we know that we're going to change the transform property. Initially, on this base class, we're not saying anything about transform, and then later we set it to translate x minus 150 pixels. So when that kicks in, transition with the transform value here tells CSS that any changes applied to the transform property or with help of the transform property should be animated. And therefore, besides the name of the property we want to animate, we also have to provide a duration over which this animation should be done. For example, 0.3 seconds. Now, as a side note, if you want to learn more about that, the potential values you can set up here, and how CSS animations work, you might want to check out a dedicated CSS course or some free CSS animation resources which you find out there. I'll not dive too deeply into that here, since it's still a Vue course in the end and not primarily a CSS or CSS animations course. Nonetheless, here we now animate changes in transform over 0.3 seconds. And we can define an easing function, which basically determines how this animation accelerates and then throttles at the end. If we now save that, you'll see if I click animate, now this animates and this moves in the duration we specified. And we are using Vue here to start this animation by setting animated block to true. Initially it's false, but we set it to true here. And that adds the animate class. So that's the part where we use Vue. But thereafter it's just CSS. And it's just the transform property combined with the transition property. And that's important. This is a perfectly fine way. It's not just fine, it's actually the recommended way for adding animations like this. Now, there is an alternative for cases where a simple transition like that is not enough, though. Let me show you that alternative as well. Besides the transition property, which we can use to tell CSS to, well, provide a transition between two changes, we can also set up a more detailed animation. For that, we first of all have to define an animation in CSS. And we do this by writing at keyframes and then any name of our choice, for example, slide fade. But again, this name is up to you. Now in here, you can define in detail how the animation should behave and which different states it should have. And you express this with percentages. You, for example, say that at 0% of animation completion, so at the start, you, for example, want to have a transformation along the x-axis of 0, so it hasn't been moved. And in addition, you set the scale to 1. Scale is another transform function which you can add to change the size of a block. Then let's say after 70% of the animation time, you want to change this to move it to 120 pixels to the left and scale it up a little bit. Make it 10% bigger by setting the scale to 1.1. 1 is the original scale, 1.1 is 10% bigger. And then here at 100%, we want to translate x to the full minus 150 pixels, so move it the entire way to the left, and set scale back to 1, so that we just bump up the size in the middle, or a little bit after the middle of the animation, and move it almost to the end here at this point, and entirely to the end here, and bring it back to its normal size. And these are the different states we have in our animation now. That's now our defined animation and the different states, the so-called keyframes, we want to reach during that animation. And we now apply this by going to our block first of all and removing transition there. We can move transition and animation together if we want to, but often you'll use just one of the two. So here I want to use an animation, hence I comment out transition. And in the class which we add eventually, I'll comment out transform and instead add the animation CSS property. That property now allows us to add an animation when that CSS class is added to an element. Here we now refer to one of our keyframe sets which we defined. So in this case at slide fade. So using this name here. Then we still specify a duration which will be split up across these keyframes. So here let's say 0.3 seconds. And also an easing function which controls how fast these different states are reached. If we start fast and end slow, or if we start slow and end fast. If we save all of that and reload, if I click animate, you see it animates, but then it snaps back to the original state. That's not a bug, that's how CSS animations behave by default. We need to add forwards here to tell CSS that we want to keep the final keyframe, the final state, as the new look, the new state of the animated element. So by adding forwards here, if we save that and reload, if I click animate, it now moves over there with our custom animation and keeps that final state. And that's how we can implement animations with CSS transitions or CSS animations. And all we're doing with view here is we're adding this animate class dynamically to the to be animated element, which of course also doesn't have to be a div, but could be anything. And often that is all you need. But there also is a scenario where this is not enough. So let's explore that next. So what would be a scenario where these basic CSS transitions and animations might not be enough? Well, first of all, and that's really important, CSS animations and transitions will very often be enough, but adding them like we're currently doing it, that might not be enough. And here's an example. In our running application, if I click Show Dialog, this modal dialog pops up immediately. It's just there and it's gone when we close it. This might be fine. This might be absolutely the behavior you want. But sometimes you might want to animate it in. You want to have a little animation when it appears, and the same for removing it. And that is the part that will be tricky with just CSS animations and with just adding CSS classes with view as we did before, especially when you also want to animate the disappearance. Let me show you why it's tricky. We can go to the base modal, which holds the code for this dialog, and there on the dialog selector here, we can add a little animation. We can, for this, again define some keyframes here and give it any name of our choice, and I'll name it modal, but again, this name is up to you. And I'll start at 0% and I want to go to 100%. And if you just define two styles, two states, as I'm doing it here, you can also use the from and to shorthands, basically. And now here we define the starting state. And there, let's say the modal should initially be invisible by setting the opacity to 0. With transform translate y, I will move it up on the y-axis by 50 pixels. And I will actually also scale it from 0.9 to its final size. And speaking of final, in 2, I now add the final states, opacity 1, translate y of 0 to reach the real position this element should have, and scale 1 to reach the real size this element should have. And now we could add this modal animation to our dialog selector to basically make sure that every dialog we're selecting with that, so the only dialog we have here, receives that animation. And by default, the animation will be played when the element is then first being part of the page, so the animation starts instantly. We can utilize this here. With animation, I can point at my modal animation here, give it a duration, ease out, and important, add forwards to tell CSS that the final state should be kept. And if we now save everything, when I click Show Dialog, we have this little animation here, as you can tell. And we have this animation because the animation is part of the dialog selector. So whenever this selector finds something on the page, and it will find something when the dialog is added to the page, which I do in app view in the end with vIf on my custom component. The whole component is only added if dialog is visible is true, and therefore the dialog element in the component is only added under that circumstances. And therefore, whenever that is the case, this animation will be played thanks to that key. But the problems start if we also want to animate the removal of the element. If I want to do that, currently it disappears instantly. The problem we'll have is that the element is detached from the DOM. And that means there is no way to animate it with CSS. It's removed instantly. You can't play an animation and then tell the browser to only remove it once that animation is finished. But that is what you would need to do in order to animate the disappearance. And that's exactly what Vue is able to help us with. Vue can help us with animating the appearance and also the disappearance of elements by, for example, delaying the disappearance until a certain animation has finished. And I will show this to you by going to App View, and there I'll add a new div. I'll come back to the modal later, but I want to start with that. Give it a class of container, and in there, let's just add a regular button. Toggle paragraph could be the text we have on the button. And then I'll add a little paragraph above that button. This is only sometimes visible. And this paragraph should be toggled whenever this button is clicked. Now, you know how that works. We can add a new data property. Para is visible, which initially is false, for example. We can add a new method anywhere in the method's key. Toggle paragraph could be the name. And in that method, we now control this newly added data property. So we set para is visible to what it's currently not, to invert its value. And then we can use para is visible with vIf to only sometimes show that paragraph. And the only remaining step now is to wire up this button with a click listener pointing at toggle paragraph. And if we do that, well, we have that paragraph which instantly appears and instantly disappears. Now let's animate both and let's see how Vue helps us there. There is a built-in component which you can wrap around the elements where you want to control the appearance and removal animation with Vue. And that's the transition component. You can wrap the element which should be animated with transition. And of course, you can wrap multiple elements per Vue app and per Vue component. And transition, this built-in component, will then manipulate this wrapped element. Important, transition must only contain one element, one direct child. There is an exception about which I'll talk later, but for the moment, keep in mind that you must only have one direct child in transition. And what does transition do with that wrapped element now? Well, it's this wrapped element which at some point of time is mounted, but which of course in this case also is not mounted initially. It's not always visible on the screen. Transition now adds a couple of CSS utility classes to that element. It adds a enter from class, an enter active class, and an enter to class. And it adds enter from first, enter active at the same time, then it removes from, but enter active stays on the element, and enter to is added right when the animation finishes. And Vue finds out how long that process should take by analyzing these special CSS classes and looking for transitions and animations inside of them to then read the duration from them. So Vue will analyze your CSS code for these special CSS class names, find out the duration, then actually add those CSS classes over the duration, and that in turn will allow you to set different styles during that entering phase of the element. And of course, you have a similar concept for removing elements. So when an element is mounted and now is not mounted anymore, because with vIf the condition turns false. Then view adds a leave from class and at the same time a leave active class. Then it removes the leave from class and adds a leave to class, and this allows you to animate the removal of elements. And the important thing again is that Vue will analyze the CSS code you write for these classes. It will read the duration of the transitions and animations you define in those classes, and then, and that's the key thing, it will only really remove the element from the DOM once that duration is over. And that's the key difference to the non-Vue behavior. Their elements are instantly added and removed with the transition component, and these special CSS classes Vue will add and look for. Vue is able to tell that an animation is taking place and how long that animation takes, and it then only removes the element once that animation is done. Now that's the theory. Let's see it in practice. So back in code, we got this wrapped paragraph, and I mentioned that Vue would add certain utility classes. Well, it does. So let's define styles for them in the CSS code. You can do this anywhere, I'll do it here. And the default class names Vue will add are v-enter-from, v-enter-active, and v-enter-to. Vue by default will add these three CSS classes at different times as explained when the element is first added to the DOM. So in this case, when the paragraph is appearing on the DOM for the first time. Now we can define different class styles here. We can define different properties. And we should include at least one transition or animation so that Vue is able to read the duration time from these classes, because I mentioned that this would be another key thing it does behind the scenes. Now in v-enter-from, you define your starting state. And for this paragraph, that could be that it initially is invisible by setting opacity to 0, and maybe that it's moved up a little bit by setting transform to translate y minus 30 pixels. This moves it up a little bit above its real position. In v-enter-to, we have the end state, so the final state we want to have at the end. And there we can have an opacity of 1 and set transform translate y to 0 to take the real position of the element it should have on the page. And v-enter-active is now the place where you, for example, add the transition CSS property to tell Vue to watch for all CSS properties that might be animated. So in this case, opacity and transform, which are the two properties changing here. Then you define a duration. That is what Vue will read. So what Vue will take to find out how long these classes should be added to the element. And then your easing function. And if you do that and you reload, you can click toggle paragraph and you have this animation for adding the paragraph. For removing, we don't have any yet, but for adding, we do. Well, and I already showed it on the slide. You have similar classes for removing. There we have the v-leave-from class, we have the v-leave-active class, and we have the v-leave-to class. And it's the same concept as for entering. We define our starting state, which for me here is the same state as the end state for entering, but it doesn't have to be the same. You can define a totally different state here, totally different CSS properties as well. That is fine. You don't have to use the same CSS properties as for adding. But here I'm doing it. In v-leave-to, I use the same state as I had for entering in my from state. Now it's the to state for leaving, making this invisible and moving it up a bit. Or actually, let's move it down a bit by setting this to plus 30 pixels, also to emphasize that you don't have to use the same styles as before. And for v-leave-active, I have the same transition setting here, but instead of ease out, I'll use ease in for a different easing function, which just controls how that duration is split across the different steps. And now if you save that and reload, we have an animation for entering and also for removing, like this. Now that is how you can use the transition component to animate the appearance and removal of HTML elements. And especially the removal is something which was harder without transition. But also for entering, you gain more flexibility with that transition component which you wrap around the element, which does use VIF or VShow and which then should be animated. You don't need it if you're not having this VIF or VShow case, because if you just have something like the block in the first example, in the last lectures, you can just conditionally add and remove CSS classes as you learned it. It's just this added to the DOM or removed to the DOM case where you can't do that because the element is just not there, and that's where transition then helps you. Now, transition can not just be used with the transition CSS property, just to make this clear. You can also use it to apply an animation. Now, we already have an animation here, slide and fade. It's actually not really fading, I guess. It's more of a slide and scale animation, so maybe let's use this as a name. And let me show you how we could add this with this transition wrapper component. So on this paragraph, I mentioned that Vue would add these special CSS classes, vEnter from, and so on. Now, if you don't want to use this transition way, because maybe you have a more complex animation with different steps, you can do this as well. Now, we don't need all classes in that case, though. We don't need vEnter from, because we have no starting state, and we have no end state. Instead, it's all defined in the animation. So in the end, we just have animation in vInteractive. Then I point at the slide scale animation, define the duration, which Vue will read as you learned, and ease out. You don't even need forwards here, because you need to keep in mind that all those special classes are being removed once the animation is over. So once this duration, which Vue reads, is over. And therefore the final end state you will see on the screen is just the regular styling you defined for this element with the other CSS rules you have. So here we don't need forwards because this class is also getting removed once the animation is over. So it can't jump back because it doesn't even know the animation anymore once it is, over. Now we can do the same for a leaving though. Don't need a from state. Don't need a to state, but for leave active instead of transition, we can use animation, slide scale, .3 seconds, ease out. If we now save that, and I reload, now we got this other style here. Now it's the style from the square from before, that's why it looks a bit strange here, but you can tell that it works. So using CSS animations with the wrapper, with this transition wrapper component, is also supported. Now, what if you had multiple transition components on your page, though? Because maybe you don't just want to animate the removal and addition of this paragraph, but also of this div or of any other element. Theoretically, that works. But you will face a problem. Vue always adds the same CSS classes to all elements, which basically means you will use the same animations and transitions for all elements. Maybe that is your requirement, maybe that is what you want, but maybe you want different transitions for different transition components on your page. And that's why you can customize those names here. We could, for example, name this para enter from, para interactive, para enter to, and the same for the leave classes instead of the v dash thing at the beginning. But with that, Vue of course wouldn't know that these are the CSS classes it should add and analyze. Instead, with just the names changed here, we have no animation, because Vue will stick to its default vEnter from, vEnter to, and so on class names. We need to tell Vue that for this transition component here, it should add the para- classes. And we do so by adding a special name prop to the transition component. Here you add your custom prefix, which in my case is para, but which can be anything you want. And if you do that, now these para-enter from, enter active, enter to, and so on classes will be added and managed and analyzed by Vue. So now with that, if you reload, the animation is back. So this name can be set and customized so that you can have multiple different transitions and transition component usages, most importantly, in the same component. Now, one more word about the naming here. You can define your own custom prefix as I explained here with the name prop in cases where you want to replace the entire class names. So you don't want to work with para, enter from, para, enter active, para, enter to, and so on, but you want to use totally custom CSS class names here. For example, because you're using some third-party CSS animation library, which gives you certain classes you need to add, where you can't change the names. For such cases, you can add more props here instead of name. You can add a enter to class prop and define your enter to class name, enter active class prop, and so on. So here you can then define your CSS class names that should be added during the enter to phase, the enter active phase, and so on. So instead of vEnter to or para-enter to, you would then add some class, and so on. Now that's not what I'm doing here. I'll revert this to name equal para, but I want to make you aware of that so that you know that you have full flexibility when it comes to these names and when it comes to which CSS classes are added at which point of time. So let's now apply what we learned about transition, about this transition component, to our modal, because that was the thing where I explained that we might need more help from Vue's side, especially for having a transition and animation when we close it. Now we can wrap transition around our own custom components just as we can wrap it around built-in elements. So we can use transition here around our base modal just like that. Now we can of course also set the name prop to define our own prefix for all those special classes Vue will add. And I will add modal here. But again, you can pick any name you want. And then we can dig into our CSS code and start defining those CSS classes. And here I'll add a modal enter from class, a modal enter active class, and a modal enter to class. And I will actually go to base modal.vue and make sure that I remove the animation from the modal there so that we don't see this animation anymore. So make sure you comment this out or remove this line. And then let's go back to app.vue, which is where we're using the base modal and where we're wrapping it with transition. And now we can define our different styles here. And it's now, of course, totally up to you how you want to animate this modal. I will actually bring over my modal keyframes here. So the keyframes from the base modal.vue file, add them here to app.vue. You can have multiple sets of keyframes in the same style tags as long as you're using different names. And I actually don't even need enter from and enter to now. We just need enter active to play an animation. And this will be the modal animation, which I just copied over. Give it a duration and an easing function. And if we do that, we'll notice a problem. If we reload, this modal has no animation. Now transition, this transition component, does work on custom components. But we have a problem here. The classes view wants to add are added to the root element of your custom component. This is this attribute fall-through behavior I talked about earlier. So these classes transition wants to add fall through to the root element in the template of base modal. But base modal happens to have two root elements, this div and this dialog. If we comment out the div for a second, if we remove that div, the backdrop, for a second, and then reload, you see it works. Now we have this animation for showing the modal. But if we have both root elements here, which we of course want, then this does not work. And it doesn't work because, as I mentioned before, this transition component wants one direct child element. Yes, it has just one child element here, just one base modal, but of course the base modal here is really just a wrapper around its template where we have two root elements. So these two root elements, this div and this dialog, these are the actual direct child elements inside of this transition component. Well, and two elements are more than one. That's why this setup here does not work. What can we do about that? How can we work around that? Well, there are various ways of solving this. We can, for example, split this into two components and manage the backdrop separately. But we could also bring this transition component over to base modal and try using it in there to transition this dialog. And that's the route I will take here. I'll remove the transition wrapper around my custom component, though it theoretically would work if our custom component had just one root element, but here it doesn't, so it doesn't work. And I will bring it over to base modal and wrap this dialog with transition. Like this. Now I can give this a name of modal and go back to app view and grab my modal specific CSS classes, to be precise, the modal interactive class here. We can remove them from app.view, remove the modal keyframes from app.view, and bring all of that over to base modal view. There we already got the modal keyframes, and now I'm also adding the modal interactive class, which points at the modal keyframes to play it as an animation. Now, however, we need to change the logic how this base modal opens. At the moment, I'm adding the base modal component in app view with vif. And this won't work if I want to use transition inside of the base modal template to animate the addition and removal of dialog. If transition is part of that template which is added and removed with vif, it won't have any effect. Therefore, I'll now open and close the modal differently. I'll add a new open prop to my base modal component and point at dialog is visible there. So forward the dialog is visible property through the open prop to the base modal component. And now in the base modal component, we can accept this prop here. So expect the open prop here. And now that we're getting it, we can simply add it here. With vif, we can check open, so this open prop, which is true or false, to control whether or not the dialog is visible or not. So now the base modal component is always added to the app view template, but inside of that base modal template, the dialog is still controlled with vif. But now it's wrapped in a transition, and now this transition has only one direct child. And of course, we also want to add vif here to the div, and pass the open prop to vif here as well to control the visibility of the backdrop. And now finally, if we reload, we got this animation and everything works properly. And we can of course now also work on a closing animation. We can add modal leave active here and play the same animation, let's say with a ease in easing function, just to keep things simple. Of course, we could also play a totally different animation here or set up a transition by also using the from and to classes. But if I do it like that, if I now reload, we got an animation for opening and also for closing. Now the closing animation certainly is a bit off because I'm just reusing the opening animation, but we can add the reverse value here to this animation on modal leave active to tell CSS to actually play this animation in reverse for this case here, for this CSS class selector. So then it will start at to and go to from if you add reverse. And with that, if I save that and reload, we got a nice animation for opening and also for closing. And now that is enabled with help of transition, keeping in mind that transition must only have one direct child element, and therefore we had to restructure this a bit, and I hope it's clear why we had to do it. But with that, we now got a nice transition for opening and for closing, so for adding and for removing this element to the DOM. Now I'll dive into some cases where we actually are allowed to have more than one element inside of transition. So I always emphasized that transition must only have one direct child element. And because of that, we had to change our base modal a little bit here to ensure that transition has only one direct child element. Well, actually, there are exceptions to that rule. There is a scenario where you might have more than one direct child element. And here it is. In AppView, I'm going to add a new div with a class of container, simply to show you a new example inside of that div. And here I'll add a good old button. But now we'll animate the button itself. And I'll have a button here where I say show users, and below that a second button where I say hide users. Well, at the moment we got no users, but for the moment I simply want to switch between these two buttons when we click them, so that we simply animate the switch from show to hide and back. Because we worked with buttons that changed their text before, but whenever we had such a button, the text on the button changed instantly, and we had no animation for that. You might not need that, but if you do, you can build this with the transition component. So first of all, let's make sure we switch between these buttons. For that, we can add click listeners here, point at show users on the first button, and then here at hide users. So show users and hide users, these are two methods we now need to add. And we also need a new data property here, which controls in which mode we are at the moment. Users are visible, could be the name of that property. Initially it's false, let's say. And then we have a method, show users, where I simply set this users are visible to true, and hide users, which is that other method we're pointing at from the other button. And here we can set users are visible to false. So this is just some dummy code, but with that, we're controlling the users are visible property here, the data property, and we can now control which button should be visible based on that property. The first button here should be visible if users are visible is false, because if they are not visible, I want to show the show users button so that we can show them. The other button, therefore, is shown if users are visible is true. If we see the users at the moment, I want to show a hide users button. With that, if we save this, we got this new button. We can click it to switch between these buttons. In reality, that of course would do something else on the page as well. Show a list of users, for example. But here I just want to focus on the transition between these two buttons. And I already said it, on the transition. At the moment, it's an instant change, which might or might not be what you want. But if you don't want it, if you want to animate this, you can use the transition component for that and wrap it around these two buttons. And you heard that right, around these two buttons. There is one exception where you are allowed to have more than one direct child element inside of your transition component. And that is the exception here. The exception is if of the child elements you have in your transition, you guarantee that at most one is added to the real DOM at the same time. And that's the case here. We got two alternative if statements, and therefore we guarantee that only one of these two buttons will be added to the real DOM at a time. So if you use transition around elements where only one is added, then this is okay. If there is a chance of both buttons being added to the page at the same time, then this is not okay. So if we had the same if condition here, then this would not be okay because now both buttons would be part of the page. But if we have the opposite if conditions here, then this is okay. Now let's add a nice little transition here. Fade-button is the prefix I will use here, but as always, this is totally up to you. And now down there in the style code, maybe here, I'll add fade button enter from, and then copy this to also add the active and to classes. And let's say we want to start with an invisible button. Then we want to go to a visible button. And we want to animate this with the transition property where we watch the opacity property. And whenever that changes, which it does here, whenever that changes, we want to let CSS animate that change over 0.3 seconds. And now we can also add the classes for removing a button. And now for the first time I will reuse some code because my enter from state is also my leave to state. My enter to state is also my leave from state. And I will have a separate active state though because I want to use a different easing function. So fade button leave active. There I set up a transition watching the opacity over 0.3 seconds with a ease in function. If I would use ease out here, we could of course also have merged it with this CSS rule, but I want to use ease in here. So now here I'm reusing a little bit of code instead of writing everything twice. I did it before to be more explicit, but now I think we got the idea, so we can write less code here. And if I now save that, we get an error. Transition expects exactly one child element or component. Now I just emphasized that it would be fine to have multiple elements if we guarantee that only one is shown at the same time. Well, the problem is Vue doesn't understand that these if conditions here guarantee us that only one button is added. It doesn't analyze the if conditions. So in order to give Vue a clear signal that it's either that or that component, we should use velse here. Because velse is pretty clear. With velse, we guarantee that only this or this component is shown. That will never have both on the screen at the same time. So now with that added, this works. And now you see we have this smooth transition here. When a button is removed, it fades out. When it's added, it fades in. But of course it's also ugly because it jumps, and during the transition we actually have both buttons on the screen, which by the way is okay here because this is now controlled by Vue. So this is certainly not what we want. We want this fade transition, but we don't want both buttons at the same time on the screen. Instead, one button should fade out and then the other button should fade in. That's the idea. And that's also something you can control. You can add the mode prop here to the transition component. And mode knows two values, in out and out in. And this controls whether first the leaving element should be animated or the new element. So if I set this to in out and reload, we get the same behavior as before, or a similar behavior. Now the addition of the button is animated first, and then the button is removed. We can switch this to out in, and now we'll have a better behavior. With out in, if we reload, Vue will first animate the removal of the button, and then animate the addition of the new button. So this allows you to control which element should be animated first, instead of animating both at the same time, which gave us this undesirable output. Now we're having a smooth animation with help of transition and multiple child elements, which is okay, as you learned, if you know that only one of them will be active at the same time, and you can give a clear signal with VIF VLs to view that this will be the case. So by now we already learned a lot about transitions, the transition component, what it does and how you may use it. Sometimes you also want to run some JavaScript code, either as part of the transition, maybe to even control the entire transition and the style changes through JavaScript, or maybe because you want to do something when an animation starts or when it ends. And Vue gives you an opportunity to do that as well. It gives you various events which are emitted by this transition component during a transition. So when a transition starts, when an element is added, or when an element is removed from the DOM. And I will show this here on this transition wrapping this paragraph. We can listen to various events here with v-on or the shorthand, the @ symbol. And the first event to which we can listen here is before enter. Here we can run code which will be executed when the element which is wrapped, this paragraph in this case, is about to enter. So when the enter animation starts. So in the end, you could say this runs whenever this enter from CSS class is being added. So right at the beginning, when the element is added and the animation starts. Now I'll add a couple of methods here which allow us to print something to the console so that we can see this all in action in the console. And here I have before enter. Now this method name is up to you, doesn't have to be before enter. Here I just want to console log before enter so that we see that we reached this event. Now we can point at before enter here at this newly added method on the before enter event. Again, the method name is up to you. The event name isn't. Before enter is one of the built-in events transition emits. And if we save that and we open the developer tools with the JavaScript console here in the browser, if I click toggle paragraph, we see before enter being printed. So that works. Now if I remove the paragraph, we don't see before enter again because it's only firing when the element enters, so when the enter animation is played. Of course, we can also listen to the leaving, though, with @before leave. Just as we have before enter, we can also listen to the event or the point of time when that element that is wrapped is leaving the DOM. So here we can also add a before leave method where we then console log before leave. Well, and of course we can now point at this method here on our before leave event handler. If we save this, reload, if I click toggle paragraph, we got before enter. If I click it again, we got before leave. Now you actually also get an argument in those methods automatically by Vue. And that is the element, hence I'll name it L here, on which this animation runs. If I console log L here and also here in before leave and save that and reload, you will notice that if I click toggle paragraph, it's printing the paragraph which was added. And the same for removing it. So if you need to do something with that element, for example, change its styling in case you want to control the animation through JavaScript, something we're going to do in the next lecture, by the way, then you can do this with help of the element, which you get automatically as an argument when listening to before enter and before leave. But before enter and before leave is not everything we have. we also have an enter event to which we can listen. This is basically the equivalent to the active CSS class. The enter event is triggered as a next step when before enter is done, you could say. Now here I want to trigger an enter method, which doesn't exist yet, but which I'll of course add now. Here, let's say I add enter and I console log enter here. We also get the element here so that we also could interact with it here if we wanted to, and I will console log it here. If we now save that and reload, if I toggle the paragraph, we see before enter first and the paragraph, and then we see enter and the paragraph. And of course we can also listen to when the animation finishes with after enter. And here I want to trigger an after enter method, which we have yet to add. This will fire whenever the animation is done, the entering animation. So here I will add an after enter method, console log after enter, and here we also get the element. So if I print that here, save that and reload, click toggle paragraph, you see we got before enter first, then enter, and then after enter. Now we have a quick animation here, so it looked like after enter was basically called directly after enter, but actually it waits for the animation to finish until after enter gets called. And I can show this by going to para enter active and ramping this up to 2 seconds, let's say. Keep in mind that View will read this duration. View analyzes this duration and it knows how long the animation will take. It will add the CSS classes appropriately and it will also trigger those events appropriately. And now after enter will only be called after 2 seconds when the animation completed. So now if I reload here and click toggle paragraph, we only see enter here, and only after 2 seconds we see after enter being printed, because that only is called when the animation finishes. And of course we have the equivalence for removing. I'll restructure this to make it a bit easier to read. We already added before leave, but of course we now also have leave, where I want to call a leave method, and after leave, which is called when the leave transition finished. Here I want to call an after leave method. So now we can add those methods as well. Here I'll add a leave method, where we also get the element where we can console log leave, and then console log L, and we got the after leave method, where we also get the element, and then we can console log after leave here, and also if we want to console log the element. With all of that, if we save this and reload, if I toggle the paragraph, we got before enter and after enter, and if I clear the console now and toggle it again, we got before leave, leave, and after leave. So this is how we can listen to that, and that allows you to run any code you want in reaction to your animation. This can be useful for a lot of things, but you can specifically also use it to control the entire animation with JavaScript instead of CSS, if you want to do that. And that's something we'll explore in the next lecture. So let's now build an entire animation with JavaScript instead of CSS. And we'll do that for this paragraph. Therefore, I will actually remove all those para-dash classes. I will simply delete them here so that we no longer use those CSS classes to control how this is being animated. Instead, I now want to use JavaScript for that. And that is something which is also supported by the transition component. Now, typically, you will most often use CSS, but using JavaScript instead can be useful if you, for example, want to use a third-party JavaScript-based animation library like GreenSock. GreenSock has nothing to do with Vue, but it is a powerful JavaScript library for orchestrating and building animations, complex animations with JavaScript. And that then would be a use case where you might want to build your entire transition with JavaScript because you might want to leverage a library like this. But even without such a library, you can use JavaScript to animate this paragraph here, for example. And that's exactly what we'll do now. For that, we already added all those hooks, and you will need those hooks here. You will need them because building an animation with JavaScript requires those hooks here. Because to some extent, they will still be called even if you have no CSS code, even if you have no CSS animation. If I reload here, for example, and keep in mind that I removed the CSS classes which were added previously, we still see before enter, enter, and after enter being called. We have no actual transition, everything is instant, but those hooks are still called. So those events on the transition component are always emitted when the wrapped element is added or removed to the DOM. But without any CSS code that controls the animation, they just execute instantly after each other, because of course there is nothing to wait for. But that's something we can change with JavaScript now. For that, in before enter, we could set up our initial animation state. For example, here we could reach out to this element, which is the element on which we want to perform the animation, and we could set a style here. We could set the style property here and give it an opacity of 0. This is a way of programmatically setting the opacity of this element to 0 initially. This is vanilla JavaScript, which we also can use here in Vue. Now that's my initial style. In enter, I now want to change this to 1, but not instantly, but over a certain duration. And that's something we can build by calling setInterval here. SetInterval is a built-in JavaScript function which allows us to execute code every few milliseconds. The second argument here is the amount of milliseconds we want to wait until the next code execution, and here we could use 20. And the first argument is a function which will now be executed every 20 milliseconds. And here we could gradually change the opacity. We can do this by using our element and setting its opacity, but now not to a hard-coded value, but to a dynamically derived value. And to dynamically derive a value based on the number of intervals we already completed, or the number of function executions we already completed, we can keep track of the current round, you could say. Add a little helper variable named round here, start at 1, and set the opacity equal to round times .1, for example. So in round 1, we set it to 10% opacity. In the next round, we'll set it to 20%. Now we just need to increment the round every time interval is called. Every time this function is called by setInterval. And we need an exit condition. And check if round is greater than 10, at which point we already reached 100% opacity. And if that's the case, I want to call clear interval and clear this interval. We can do this by storing the interval, or a unique ID pointing at that interval, you could say, in a constant, and passing this to clear interval. So now the interval will be cleared, will be stopped, if we exceeded 10 rounds. And now we should animate this over time. But with that alone, we'll have a small problem. It will work, I will say that. If I reload, we can see that the paragraph fades in, right? That is something you can see. And if it's too fast, you can slow it down by only increasing this by 1%, let's say, and waiting for 100 rounds. Now we'll wait 2 seconds in the end until this is fully visible. So if we save that and reload, now this fades in slowly here. But you'll notice a problem here on the right. If I reload, clear the console and click toggle paragraph. It fades in over 2 seconds, but after enter is actually called right at the start. Watch again. I click toggle paragraph and after enter is called right away. This might or might not matter to you. Maybe it does not matter to you. Maybe you don't care about this. But actually the order is wrong, as you can tell. It's called too early. And in some cases this might matter. And this is not a bug, but instead Vue has no chance of knowing when it should call after enter. To us it's obvious. I mean, we're done with enter once we in the end make it into this if condition. But that's something Vue doesn't really understand. That's way too logical. It doesn't parse and try to understand our code and our reasons behind writing that code. Instead, we have to tell Vue when we're done here. And for that, enter actually receives a second argument automatically. And that's a done function, which you can call whenever you want to signal to Vue that you are done in this hook. You don't need to call it if you're having CSS-based animations, because then Vue is able to read the duration in the CSS code. But if you're not using CSS, if you have your own logic and the duration is simply just made up by incrementing round and checking this condition and having a certain interval time here, then you need to call done explicitly to let Vue know when you're done. So here, after clear interval, we call done. We call this done argument as a function to let Vue know when we're done. If I reload here, now we can toggle the paragraph and you see after enter is now really only called at a later point of time once we are indeed done. And this is now how you can control animations with JavaScript. And of course, we're not limited to controlling the enter animation with JavaScript. We can also write something similar for leaving. And definitely feel free to write the equivalent for this enter animation for the leave case. So basically the opposite, going from 1 to 0. Here is a quick pause for you to pause the video and try this on your own, and thereafter we'll do it together. So, were you successful? Let's try it together now. And for that here, in leave, I will basically use the same logic as I had here for entering. I'll copy this entire code and bring it over to leave, but I'll do the opposite here. I will basically set my opacity to 1 minus this calculation so that we start at 1 and I reduce it. And thereafter we can leave the rest of the code as it is. However, in before leave, I of course also want to set the initial opacity to 1, though that is a bit redundant because that is our end state and our initial state of the rendered and attached element anyways. Nonetheless, we can set it here to be very clear about the fact that this is our starting state for the leave animation. And of course, we also need to accept this done argument here in the leave method so that we can call it here when we are done. Now we can also, of course, work with different timings here, a different amount of rounds if we wanted to, but I'll leave everything as it is. And with that, if I reload, I can toggle a paragraph to animate it in, and then I can also animate it out. And that is how you can control animations with JavaScript. Now, by the way, if this is animating in, and I then click toggle paragraph, again, this automatically cancels and reverses it. However, you also see it flickers a little bit. And it's flickering because in the end, it's playing 2 animations at the same time. If we cancel the first animation, that effectively just means that the leave animation starts before the entering animation finished, or the other way around. So then both animations are playing at the same time, resulting in that flickering which you saw here. And that's also something we can prevent. Because there is another useful event which is emitted by the transition component. And that is the enter dash cancelled event and the leave cancelled event. And here we can execute methods which are called whenever the animation is cancelled. And by the way, those events are always emitted when it's cancelled, no matter if you're writing your logic with JavaScript, as we're doing it here, or if you would be using CSS as we did before. Whenever one transition isn't finished, when you start a new transition, the respective cancelled event will be emitted. So here we can have an enter cancelled method and a leave cancelled method that should be called. Now let's add those two methods therefore. Enter cancelled and leave cancelled. And of course here we can now also log something to the console. We also get the element here and we could change it. But I want to do one important thing here. If the enter animation gets cancelled, I want to cancel my enter interval here, this interval, immediately before it completes, so that it's not just cleared if the rounds reach 100, but that I also clear it if enter cancelled is triggered, so that the enter animation is immediately cancelled when the leave animation starts. And I want to do the same in leave cancelled. The problem is that we store our interval in constants which are part of the enter and the leave methods. So these constants are only available inside of these methods and not available inside of enter and leave cancelled. But the solution is simple. These are regular methods in the methods property, right? So in the end, we can just use data property to store those intervals. And we can have our enter interval here, which initially is null, and our leave interval, which initially is null. And now we store the interval we create here in the enter method in this enter interval, and we clear this enter interval here, and we do the same in the leave method. There we store the interval in this leave interval, and we cancel this leave interval. We'll face a little problem here, because here we're accessing this leave interval and this enter interval inside of a nested function, and in there the this keyword will unfortunately not refer to the same thing, to the view app object, as it does outside of this nested function. The workaround is simple. We use an arrow function. There the this keyword is not overwritten and will therefore keep its context. So make sure that in both set interval calls you use an arrow function. And with that we can now use leave and enter interval, those new data properties, also in the cancelled methods. And we can call clear interval on this enter interval, and in leave cancelled, clear interval on this leave interval. And if we save this, my setup complains that I'm never using the L property. Well, therefore, for completeness sake, I will log it here. Alternatively, you omit it if you don't need it. But I will just leave it here so that it is clear that we would be getting it. Log it here, save it, everything saves now. And now if we click toggle paragraph and click again, now we have no flickering, because now we're canceling this, we're clearing the interval, and we're going back to removing this therefore. So this is now enter and leave cancelled, that these events exist and what you can do with them. Now we saw JavaScript-based animations in action with help of these special events, and I just want to emphasize again that these events are always emitted no matter if you control your animation with JavaScript or not. If you control it with CSS as we did before, those events are also emitted so that you can run any code you want. But you can also leverage those events, as you saw in the last lecture, to control the entire animation through JavaScript, either through your own JavaScript code as we did it, or by using another third-party JavaScript animation library, for example. Now, if you control your entire animation through JavaScript, as we're doing it here on this paragraph now, you can add another property on this transition. Instead of setting a name, which we don't need now, you can add the CSS prop and bind it to false. Now, what does this do? This tells Vue that this transition, controlled by this transition component on this paragraph, will not use CSS. It will not use a CSS transition or a CSS animation defined in CSS code. Instead, the entire transition will be controlled through JavaScript. And why is this a helpful piece of information we can pass to Vue? It's technically not required. As you saw, it worked. But now, by passing this prop, we tell Vue that it doesn't even need to search for the respective CSS classes in our CSS code for this transition. It doesn't even need to try to read the duration from our CSS code, because it won't find it, because we're not using CSS code. Therefore, it skips this CSS analysis step. It skips searching for the respective CSS classes and the duration of this animation in CSS, and that simply improves performance a little bit, because it doesn't need to do this unnecessary step. Hence, you should of course only add CSS false if you really don't use CSS code for this transition. And for example, on the other transition usages we have here, like on these two alternative buttons, we absolutely must not set CSS to false, because there we are relying on CSS transitions and animations. But if you don't do that, if you just control your animation through JavaScript only, then you can set CSS to false to optimize performance. With that, if I reload, this still works as before, but now even a bit more performant. We'll not notice the difference here, but it is there, and tiny things like that can make your app faster in the end. Now, up to this point, we always added the addition or removal of just one element. I mean, even with the two buttons here, it was about having just one button active on the page at the same time. But sometimes you also have lists of data which you want to animate. So you have multiple list items and you might want to animate this. And thankfully, Vue got you covered for that as well. I'll add a new component, listData.view. The name, of course, is up to you. And I'm just using that new component to keep the code split up and keep it manageable, since AppView is already a large component with a lot of code in there. So listData.view is a simple component. We'll have an unordered list in there, and we'll have a little bit of dummy list data in our component object here. Now it's up to you which data you want here. I will have a user's key and have Max, Manu, Julie, Angela, and Michael here as names, but you can of course add as many names as you want. Now my goal is of course to output those items here in a list, so we can use v4 to loop through the users, so user in users, also add a key and point at user, since we have unique values in there, and output the username here then. So it's a very simple list. It also doesn't have any fancy styling at the moment. Now we can go to AppView and import it here as a local component, for example. So let's quickly import list data, or actually let's name it users list. Makes a bit more sense, I guess. So let's import users list from /components users list.view. And then as you learned it and did it multiple times in the course, we can register it as a local component here, users list. And now that it is imported and registered, maybe here at the very top, we can add a new div with class container and then render our users list component here, the newly added component. And with that, we got our users list up here. Now let's add a little bit of styling to make it look a little bit nicer in the users list .view file, we can add a scoped style tag here. And on the unordered list, I'll set list style to none to remove the bullet point, set the margin to 0 and the padding to 0. And every individual list item is then styled by giving it a border of 1 pixel, solid, and a light gray color, and a padding of 1 rem. And I'll set text align here to center the text. And now that is the list we have here. Now this is a very simple list, and at the moment it's not animated at all. Let's make sure we can now add and remove items to it, and then let's make sure that we can animate this, because that's something that's missing in all the examples we saw throughout this course. So to make sure new items can be added, in userslist.view in the template below my unordered list, I'll add another div here, simply as a wrapper, and then have an input element here of type text, and a button where I say add user. And the idea, of course, is that we take whatever was entered here and add it as a user to users. And on the other hand, if a list item is clicked, that user should be removed. So I'll add a click listener to a list item and say remove user here and pass the user as an argument to remove user. And on this button, on the other hand, I'll add a click listener and say add user. We could also use a form here if we wanted to, but I'll just add a good old click listener on this button. So now we can add methods and add an add user method and a remove user method. And on remove user, we'll get the user name. We're passing it here as an argument, so we get it here as a parameter. And we can then set this user's equal to this user's filter, searching for the user that is equal to the user we're getting here. So if we got a user that's equal to the user we're currently looking at, we want to filter it out actually by inverting this, so that we keep all users where the names are not equal to the user we're getting here, and if the name is equal, we return false. Hence we filter it out, and therefore our new users is the old array minus the user with the username we got here. In add user, we want to get what the user entered here, and I'll use a ref for that. Username input is my ref, which I'll use here. And in add user, we got the entered username by reaching out to this ref's username input.value. We could add validation, but I want to keep it simple, and therefore simply push my entered username to users. And actually, I'll not push it, I'll unshift it to add it at the top. Now with that, if we reload, if I click Julie, she's removed. If I add Julie again, she's back at the beginning. And we can also add some spacing here by going back to the unordered list and actually adding a margin of 1 rem top and bottom, 0 left and right by adding this rule here. So now we got this in place. You can of course optimize the styling, but I rather want to focus on animating now. I want to ensure that we animate when an item is removed or added. And that is something we can do with View. In the end, what we want to do here is we want to wrap this list item with transition, because we want to animate the addition and removal of list items. But we'll have a problem. It's not just one list item. Because of v4, we'll have multiple list items here. And therefore transition won't work, because transition is there to work with one element. But Vue has got us covered. It has the transition group component in addition to transition. Transition group, as the name suggests, is there to work with multiple elements, and it can also animate multiple elements at the same time. So it's great for lists, where in this case we only add or remove one user at the same time. But of course you could have other lists where multiple items are added or removed at the same time. And that is why transition group is great for lists. It is capable of animating individual list items, but also multiple items at the same time. There's one important thing you gotta know about transition group though. Transition, the component we used before, in the end renders no element to the DOM. It's just here in the template to give Vue some instructions, but you don't see it in the actual DOM. If we inspect show users, which is the button we're animating, there is no transition component here in the DOM. Now that will be different for this list and transition group though. Transition group will render an element to the DOM in the end. And you can control which element that is by giving it the tag prop. And here we want an unordered list. So we in the end replace our wrapper here, the unordered list, with transition group, giving it a tag of UL. And you can use any valid HTML element here. You can also use a custom component here. Now besides that, it works pretty much like transition though. It also adds those CSS classes to the elements which are added or removed. It dives into the CSS code to see how long an animation takes. So here I'll add the name prop and give it a name of user list. And that is then the prefix in front of the enter from, enter active, enter to classes, everything you already learned about. So here in my styling, I will now add user list, enter from, copy that, and then also add enter active and enter to. And now as so often, it's totally up to you what you want to add here. I will add an opacity of 0 here and transform my items to translate them along the x-axis and move it a little bit further to the left. And that's my starting position when an item is added. In enter to, I will then set this to 0 and the opacity to 1, of course. And in enter active, we can add the transition property and watch for changes in all CSS properties which might change. And in this case, only opacity and transform will change. And then add a duration, and I'll go for 1 second here, and then also a easing function, and I'll go for ease out. And if we do that, you will see, if I reload and I add Praveen, if I click add user, this is a smooth animation for adding this element. Now, of course, we also get animations for removing elements. For that, I'll in the end just copy my enter classes and add my leave classes here. So leave from, leave to, leave active. And I want to leave from opacity 1 and no change on the x-axis. And therefore, we can also merge this with the enter to class because it's the same. On leave active, I want to have a ease in easing function instead of ease out. And on leave to, I want to go to an opacity of 0, but then move it 30 pixels to the right. So it's not the same as the enter from state. There we had minus 30 pixels. Here I have plus 30 pixels. If I do that and save this, if I click an item, you see it's animated out like this. Which is nice, but you might notice that the list jumps. When an item is removed, the other elements snap in place thereafter. And thankfully, Vue actually has a solution for that as well. It helps us avoid such snapping. Now, how can Vue help us with this snapping behavior we got here, which is not too nice to look at? It adds another special class when you're using transition group. So when it's actually controlling multiple elements instead of just one. Because you might not notice it, actually, whilst we're only adding and removing one element at a time here, we are animating multiple elements simultaneously because the other elements also need to switch their position when a new item is added. And that's why we use transition group. It is capable of animating multiple elements. And it gives us a special class, therefore, which allows us to control the animation of the other elements which are not getting added or removed, but which also might need to move around to make place for the new element or to fill up the space of the leaving element. And the special class we add here is our prefix, so user list in this case, since that's the prefix we defined here with the name property. And then dash move. That's another special CSS class which view will add to all the other elements which are not entering or leaving. And even better than that, view will automatically move them to their new place under the hood by using the transform CSS property. That's just something you have to know. View will use transform under the hood for moving the elements which are not added or removed around to their new position. And therefore here in the move class, we can actually transition the transform property on those elements, let's say over 0.8 seconds, with a ease function. So just ease to distribute the time evenly. Now if we save that and go back, we'll be able to see that if we reload and add a new user, Praveen for example, you see the other elements move smoothly to their new position. Now if we reload and try this for removing though, we still have this snapping behavior. There's one thing we gotta fix for that to work on the leave active class, so which is added to the leaving element. We need to add a position of absolute. Once we add that to the leaving element and I reload, now you see the other elements move as well, and they move to their new position. Now the rest of the page jumps, but that's something we can't avoid here. But inside of that list, we have a smooth animation for entering items, but also for leaving items, and for the rest of the list for all the items that need to move to a new position. And that is how transition group can help us here. It allows us to animate items in a list, multiple items at the same time. It allows us to move items smoothly, even if they're not directly affected. So even if they're not the added or removed item. And therefore, it is the component you should use if you want to add multiple items. If you have one item or two alternating items you want to animate, transition is the component you should use, because that component is optimized for animating single items or alternating items like these two buttons. By now we got a pretty good understanding about how Vue helps us with animating things. There's one specific kind of thing which you might want to navigate, which we haven't seen thus far though, and that would be changes between two routes. For that, I'll quickly add routing here, simply by adding a new pages folder, and then in here we could have all users page, let's say, and also a course goals page. I will not really populate those components with live or with real values. I just want to dive into how we can animate between these pages. For that here, I'll simply add a div with a class of container in the template of all users and add a h2 tag where I say all users. And I'll then copy that and add the same here to course goals. But of course here I will say course goals so that we can tell these two pages apart. So these are very simple dummy components which just have templates. Now we can quit the development server with Ctrl+C and npm install -- save the Vue router. This package which we already installed in the routing module. Once it is installed, we can restart the development server and then add routing as you learned it in the routing module. So here in main.js or in a separate router.js file, but since we'll only have 2 routes, I'll go with main.js. You can import create router from view router and also already import create webHistory and then set up the router here. So here we have the router. We create it with create router and pass a config object to create router, set the history to the result of create webHistory, and then add our routes. And I want to have 2 routes here. The first route should be applied if we have /nothing. In this case, I want to load the all users component. Therefore, we should import it, all users from /pages all users.view. And we can also already import course goals from /pages course goals.view. And then load all users here on this first route. And then add a second route with a path of /goals, let's say, where we want to load the course goals component. So these are the 2 routes I have here. Now we can call app use to register this router with our Vue app. And with that, Vue is aware of these routes. Now, as you learned it, in order to load a route and to display it, we need to go to our app Vue file. And in there, I will actually remove all the content we had in there and just add router view so that we just switch between these 2 components based on which route we selected. In order to move back and forth between these components from inside the running app, I will actually also go to all users and add a router link to my course goals. So therefore the 2 prop points at /goals, because that was the path I'm handling here. And I will copy that, and in course goals, I'll add the same link, but I'll go to just / here, which therefore goes to all users. If we save that, I got some complaints here that I'm not using the users list component anymore in app view. And that's correct, I'm registering it here, but I'm not doing anything with it in my template. So we can comment this out and remove this import, or remove the components option entirely here. And now with that saved, we see all users, and we can switch between those routes. That's all nice, but it has nothing to do with animations. Well, I want to animate the transition between these 2 routes. And thankfully, we can do this. Now, one thought you could have is that you wrap your router view with transition. I mean, it's a regular component, and if we want to animate with Vue's help between 2 components, like the button we saw earlier, then we wrapped the element with transition, right? That's what we did previously in this course when we wanted to animate components. And we could then define some new CSS classes here. Route enter from, route enter active, and route enter to. And I want to use an animation, so I will actually only use route enter active and use my slide scale animation, the keyframes which are set here, over 0.4 seconds. And with a ease function or ease out, let's say. And then also define route leave active. Of course, depending on which animation you want to build, you could also add route leave from and route leave to. But here I again just want to apply an animation, and that will be slide scale over the same duration with ease in. And now, since I named these CSS classes like this with route, we could apply this name to this transition, like that. But since I always say could and so on, this probably is not how it's going to work. And indeed, We do have some strange behavior here, but we actually see that router view can no longer be used directly inside of transition. Now, it says no longer because previously, with older versions of Vue, that did work. So maybe if you learned that, you're still used to this old way of doing it. With Vue 3, this is no longer possible. And we actually get the solution here in the warning as well. We need to restructure our code. Transition now needs to go inside of our router view. So we should move transition inside there. But this alone now also won't do it, because while router view supports getting content that will be rendered inside of it, now we also need to tell it where to actually render the actual page, the actual component that should be rendered based on the route that is active. And for that, we can use the scoped slot syntax router view uses under the hood. Normally, we don't need it, but for transitions with routes, you do need it. You can use this vslot directive, which I introduced earlier in the course when we talked about slots, to extract the slot props you're getting here. You get those by the router view component, which is built in. And you can then use the dynamic component to bind it to slot props dot component. So slot props have a property named component with a capital C, which holds the component that should be loaded for the currently selected route. And this strange looking syntax is what you need to animate switches between these components. If you now save this, you no longer get the warning. And now this kind of works, but of course this looks really stupid here, right? I mean, it's just moving around and we got two components on the page at the same time. So this is not fully what we want. But technically this is correct at least. But one thing we want to change here is something we already saw earlier when we switched between two buttons. We want to make sure that only one component is shown on the page at the same time. And you might remember that we can achieve this by adding the mode prop to the transition component. And there we had out in and in out. And if we use out in, we ensure that first the leaving component is animated before then the entering component is animated. So with that, if I reload, now this leaves and then we have the new component. I will admit it still looks strange, but that's just because of the animation CSS code we set up. If we use a different animation, like the fade button classes we have here, if I use this as a name here, fade button, this will look nicer. With that, we got a nice fade animation between these routes. So that is how you can animate route transitions. Now, one thing you might have noticed before is that when you used that other animation, which looked a bit strange, the route animation here, we even saw that animation when we loaded the page for the first time. So you have this initial animation. The reason for that is that with the Vue router, technically the first active route is an empty route. And then when your page starts, when your page is loaded for the first time, it immediately switches to the route that should be used for the given path in your URL. That means that technically when the app starts, the Vue router goes from no route to the chosen route for the given path. And hence it plays an animation because we go from one component, nothing, to the to be loaded component. To avoid this behavior, you can go to main.js where you register the router, and there you can actually use the router to call the isReady method on it. This method will let you know when the router successfully evaluated which page should be loaded. This gives you a promise, and hence you can call then on it. And in the function you pass to this then block, in this function, the router will now not go from the empty to the to be selected page, but instead at this point of time, it is aware of the page that should be loaded, and it will therefore not make this initial transition. So you can then mount your app inside of this function to only mount and therefore render your app once the router is fully set up and aware of the page that should be loaded. And if you do that and reload, you don't have this initial animation. Now you just have it if you switch routes. And now I'm going back to the other animation since that looked nicer. So to the fade button animation here. But that is it. That is how you can animate the transition between different routes. It's a strange looking syntax maybe, but you really only need it for this transition scenario. But with that, you're now able to also animate changes between different pages.